Hi everyone, please subscribe to my channel. Blood Immortal. See playlist for other chapters and novels. Join now our Telegram channel now and enjoy exclusive early access. t.me/blood_immortal_official. I do not translate the novels. Credits goes to original translator and author of the novel. I only make it as an audiobook so it would be easier to just listen while doing other things. Credits goes to the author of the novel. I convert stories to audiobook for mental health, for multitasking purpose, for accessibility and time saving. Listening to audiobook is also beneficial for people who have disability. It improves our listening skills and improve our English comprehension, vocabulary and other things. So, thank you for listening. Thank you and thank you very much for your support. Chapter 41. It was freezing. Even though he was injured, a rancor was still a rancor. Yuan felt a chill just by being near him. The penalty must be considerable. Yuan did not antagonize Crises. If possible, Yuan wanted Crises to stay out of the fight until Hephaestus woke up. And the penalty of the tower was greater when a rancor attacked a lower-level player. It was a different case from when Hephaestus fought other players who had attacked him. I know. Crises endured the pressure of the tower on his body with his bare body. Healing the burst wound with fire, Crises created a spear once more. What's your relationship with Hephaestus? A guest. Crises thought for a moment, wondering what he meant, and then made a dumbfounded expression. A guest. It seemed that he had commissioned or repaired items at Hephaestus' workshop, which he had created as a disguise. So, did he get involved in this battlefield just because of that kind of relationship? Yuan exhaled deeply. With Crises' intrusion, the other players were keeping their distance to avoid getting involved. The moment I relax, my body will turn to ash. His opponent was a rancor. He was also a confidant of Apollo, who sat on the throne of fire. At this point, Crises may have just become a rancor, but his skills were not to be ignored. I'll use the penalty. As he climbed the tower and fought against Olympus, he knew that he would one day fight a rancor. It was just a little earlier than expected. There was no need to panic. If I factor in the injury and the penalty within 5 more times. If Crises could use all of his power, it would have been an impossible fight. However, considering the injuries he sustained from the fight with Hephaestus and the penalty for a rancor attacking a lower-level player, I can do it. Fortunately, the element was not bad. Since he had the fire eye and the flame magic outfit, his resistance to fire was quite high. Yuan had already experienced and survived Surtur's annihilation in the tutorial. Moreover, this place was the first floor. No matter how much of a rancor he was, his power was bound to be greatly weakened by the tower's restrictions. Woo Duke. Yuan's arm twisted. Mana filled Yuan's right arm, causing it to swell up like a balloon filled with air. At that sight, the eyes of Crises and Agamemnon grew wide. Gigantification. Yuan's most powerful skill. It was also one of the skills that symbolized Olympus. You have quite the unusual skill. Gigantification was a skill that only Hercules possessed within Olympus. Numerous rancors had coveted the same gigantification as Hercules, but in the end, no one had obtained it. That meant that gigantification was an outstanding skill that even most rancors did not possess. 1. Warroar. The flame spear in Crises' hand emitted intense heat. Even so, you're just a new player who just entered the tower. Flash. A sun flew before Yuan's eyes. No, for a moment, he had such an illusion. Yuan stretched out his giant's arm with all his might. Kwaang. Gigantification is resisting, fragment of the sun. Fire Eye is resisting, fragment of the sun. Flame Magic Outfit is resisting, fragment of the sun. Waruric, the gigantification that had broken through the Chimera Maker's armor and defense in one breath. However, it seemed that it was impossible to defend against a rancor's attack with just power alone. Resistance to fragment of the sun has failed. Abnormal status. Burn begins. His arm burned red. The pain from being burned by a hot stove was transmitted through his arm. He had managed to barely block it, but it was not without damage. I should have gotten some ice cream. What if he had taken ice cream like when he fought Surtur? If I had taken the cold pill like when I fought against Surtur, I could have increased my resistance to fire at the very least, even if my movements were a bit stiff because of the cold. However, that regret was short-lived. Whoosh. Crisis. Next attack was right before Yuan's eyes. Roar. Bang. A crimson flame swept over Yuan like a wave with a physical form. No, it wasn't a flame but more like lava. But it was impossible for Crisis to summon lava on the first floor, where there wasn't an upper level and where there were restrictions. Unless the high-ranker Apollo had come down in person. I don't have time to rest. Buzz, buzz, buzz. 3 mana pods were created around Yuan. The 3 mana pods absorbed an enormous amount of mana. And soon, the mana pods created around Yuan released their energy. Qua! The mana pods shot towards the wave of flames. But that only reduced the force of the incoming wave. Quat! The wave of flames swept over Yuan's body. He raised his arms, which were still giant-sized, to protect his body, and increased the power of Fire Eyes to resist the flames. Fire Eyes resists against Fragment of the Sun. Fire Magic Clothing resists against Fragment of the Sun. Failed to resist against Fragment of the Sun. Abnormal status. Burn rises to stage 2. Messages appeared one after another. His body was burning up as if it was going to turn into a piece of meat. Smoke rose from Yuan's body like steam, and his legs gave out, making him stagger. The ends of the fire magic clothing were charred. No matter how resistant it was to fire, a ranker's fire wasn't something to be taken lightly. Now twice. Crackle, crackle, a bright yellow current ran through Crisis' body. It was the second stage of the penalty. Yuan wasn't the only one staggering because of the difficulty. Crisis was also staggering and putting strength into his legs because of the injuries he had sustained from the penalty and his fight with Hephaestus. If I just hold on a little bit longer. He blinked once. It was just for a moment, and he thought the distance was enough. But, whoosh, Crisis, who had been staggering, disappeared, replaced by flames. Quang, cuck, Crisis, fist, which had suddenly appeared close by, struck Yuan in the chest. Crack, the sound of bones breaking rang in his ears. That wasn't the end. Bang, the tip of Crisis' fist exploded, sending Yuan's body flying into the air. Shoo, Quang, Yuan's body, which had overcome gravity, flew through the air and hit the wall in an instant. The hard wall crumbled, and Yuan was embedded in the debris of the collapsed building. Rumble, thud, thud, cough, debris from the building fell over Yuan's head. Yuan tried to move his body a little but frowned from the pain in his chest. Did I underestimate the first floor? No matter how new of a ranker his opponent was, a ranker was still a ranker. Even with the restrictions and penalties of the first floor, and even if he was injured, he wasn't an opponent that he could overcome right now. This is tough. Even with Fire Eyes, Fire Magic Clothing, and Giant Transformation, he thought he would be able to hold on until Hephaestus woke up. Still, this makes it 3 shots. Yuan groaned from the pain in his chest and lifted his body. His bones were broken, but he could still move. Thanks to the stats he had increased with Heavenly Star and the stamina and strength he had gained from taking Heart of a Giant, and because he had protected his body with his hand, which was still in Giant Transformation. I have 1 or 2 shots left. The direction of the fight was drawn in Yuan's head. To hold on to that. He needed that, after all. Swoosh. At that moment, a faint light caught his eye from the rubble of the collapsed building. Yuan turned his head twice. It was a familiar place. What is that? Even though there was still 1 ranker and dozens of players outside. I'm also lucky. Yuan smiled and stretched out his hand. Crack. The penalty for the 3rd attack began. Cretis gritted his teeth and endured the penalty. Along with the pressure applied to his body, high-voltage electricity flowed through him. When the penalty ended, Cretis finally collapsed on the floor, his legs giving out. Cretis coughed up blood from his mouth. Cough, cough. His mouth opened on its own. This is a penalty. Cretis, who had been looking up at the ranker without looking down, had almost never experienced a penalty. Even if he had never used this much strength to come down to the first floor, so he did not know the fear of the penalty. Penalty, you'll probably know once you experience it. Those were the words his god, Apollo, had given him when Cretis was about to go down to receive the first floor mission. How great a power flows in this tower. At first, he didn't understand what he meant. What kind of power was it that even Apollo, one of the best in Olympus, called great? But he seemed to understand after experiencing it. You could be annihilated. The penalty was different from the simple skills that Cretis knew. It was, so to speak, will. At the end of the sense of his existence being annihilated, Cretis felt the intense intervention of something huge. Is it the will of the tower to prevent excessive intervention from above? It was amazing. He had thought that this tower was just a huge world where he could live a new life, but it had a will as if it were alive. And that will tried to annihilate him, who was using excessive force to protect the ecosystem of the lower floors. Anyway, I guess this is the end. You've worked hard. Agamemnon approached Cretus and bowed his head. In fact, this mission would have been impossible without Cretus' help. He had captured Hephaestus using the replica version of Aegis and dealt with the crazy new player who had suddenly appeared. It was all thanks to Cretus' help. Hurry up and escort the criminal. Check on the casualties and treat the injured. And Cretus' gaze turned to the collapsed building. The place where Yuan was crushed. Just leave him alone. Cretus looked back at him with a surprised expression. Yes, then surely in the future. Anyway, the mission is over. We were the ones who broke the law by causing a riot on the first floor. I want to avoid unnecessary bloodshed. Agamemnon bit his lip at the stubborn response. He didn't like it, but there was nothing he could do. Cretus had the initiative on this battlefield. I understand. Then. That was when, Kwang, the debris of the collapsed building rose up, and dusty soil rose. And from within it, Yuan, holding a sword in his hand, was seen walking out. Agamemnon's eyes lit up again. That bastard who's about to die. Wait, Agamemnon shouted at Cretus' renewed dissuasion. Do you still think the same as before? That bastard is trying to attack again. That's not it. Cretus shook his head. The reason he stopped him was not because he wanted to avoid killing like before. Crackle. Yuan walking out through the dust. That's. Crackle. In his hand, rare dark attribute mana was constantly bursting out. Dangerous. True Black Soulstone. Chapter 42. A collapsed building. That place was originally a workshop that Hephaestus used. It was a small building in the slums that he remodeled into a workshop. The building was shabby and old, and it wouldn't have been strange if it collapsed at any moment. Yuan flew after being hit by Chrysis' fist and crashed into the workshop building. And inside it, he found the black stone. No, it was now the true black stone that had been perfectly crafted. Dangerous, you say? Agamemnon made a puzzled expression at Chrysis' words. His face, looking at Chrysis for a moment, was filled with irritation. He wanted to finish the mission of capturing Hephaestus as soon as possible in return, but time kept getting delayed. He's a guy who's dying. There's nothing to be afraid of. Dark attribute mana is a special case. Furthermore, even though he looks like he's dying, the mana he's emitting. That's enough. Agamemnon, who had reached his limit of patience, cut him off. No matter how great his talent is, he's still just a new player. He looks exhausted, so let him rest now. Agamemnon's gaze turned back to Yuan. We'll take care of the rest. It was strange. Yuan, who had been standing in front of the collapsed building just a moment ago, had disappeared. Where did he go? Bang, the sound of something exploding. The direction was where Hephaestus had collapsed. Agamemnon, startled, turned his head. Gook, ack, boom, crash. The subordinates who had moved to move Hephaestus were thrown into the air like bowling pins. In an instant, the battlefield became a pandemonium again. Yuan was once again standing next to Hephaestus, and Agamemnon bit his lip. What are you doing, you bastards? Agamemnon shouted hysterically. Are you just going to watch? Go kill him. I'll give a management position to the one who kills him. Rush him all at once. Hephaestus' petrified body continued to squirm. The status effect, petrification, was merely a skill that stopped movement. It didn't solidify the mind. In other words, Hephaestus was still struggling to break the petrification. Let's go all at once. Although their individual abilities were insignificant, the power of numbers could not be ignored. Yuan held his sword tightly as he faced the incoming waves of enemies. He held the black stone in one hand and the sword in the other, releasing mana with all his might. Flash! A wave of mana burst out in an instant. Swoosh! Shua! Chuaak! In the place where the dark attribute mana passed, the necks of the incoming players were cut, and their arms and torsos twisted unnaturally, revealing their bones. Screams resembling the sound of a broken guzheng could be heard from the crowd of players. Yuan fought against the incoming waves and continued to draw out the power of the black stone. Crackle, kaboom. In the fragment held in Yuan's hand, the mana attribute changed constantly, and the mana exploded and amplified. And only Chrysis and Agamemnon noticed the existence of that item. You have an absurd item. Is it a reward from the tutorial? Chrysis looked at Yuan, who was fighting dozens of players who had reached a higher floor than him, in admiration and turned his head to look at Agamemnon, whose face had turned white. What did I say? Chrysis clicked his tongue as if to tell him to look. Agamemnon bit his lip. He had no idea what had happened. He was sure that he couldn't find any sign of having such an item just a moment ago. The tower has summoned a monster. Do you have time to say such leisurely things right now? Agamemnon glared at Chryses. If he could kill someone with his gaze, he would have done so already. Why, though, you said you'd take care of it yourself. So you're saying we should just sit here and do nothing? My role was to tie up Hephaestus in the first place. If the opponent is a new player, shouldn't you guys take care of it according to the tower's rules? Are you saying that now? Chryses chuckled at Agamemnon's sensitive reaction. Indeed, it was understandable why he felt that way. Since he had already lost so many of his followers and had even lost Hephaestus, whom he had just found, Agamemnon's position within Olympus would almost disappear. Don't worry. Chryses forced himself to get up and patted Agamemnon on the shoulder. I plan to see the end of this too. Thud. As Chryses took a step, large drops of sweat dripped from his forehead. He had already reached the point where he could no longer withstand the penalty. Chryses's movements as he walked were so precarious that it wouldn't be strange if he collapsed at any moment. Yuan noticed Chryses like that. At the same time, he flicked his fingers holding the black magic stone and waved his hand around him. Crackle, whoosh, the flames absorbed the darkness attribute mana. As the black flames, which were a combination of the two attributes, enveloped Yuan's body, the players who were rushing in hesitated. Creak, only Chryses walked through the flames. He reached out his hand as if the flames that Yuan had spread out were nothing and held the flames in the palm of his hand. Amazing, whoosh, whoosh. Chryses, who saw Yuan's flames in his hand, let out a quiet exclamation. Fire and darkness. It would be amazing to handle just one attribute of mana, but he was controlling two attributes of mana at the same time. Even the best rankers couldn't control mana to this extent. Are you not thinking of joining Olympus? If your goal is equipment, I promise you something much better than what you gave to Hephaestus. Yuan shook his head. That can't be the goal. Indeed, that's true. And if that's the answer, I've already given it to the other side. Yuan said so and pointed to Agamemnon, who was standing on one side and watching. The answer is no, right? Of course. That's unfortunate. He thought there was no chance. Nevertheless, Chryses wished he could have attracted Yuan even with a 1% chance. Yuan was that tempting of a gem. Then there's nothing I can do. Roar. Chryses's flames devoured Yuan's flames. The surroundings, which had been blazing with black flames, turned red. Half of the surroundings were dominated by Yuan's black flames, and the other half by Chryses's red flames. The flames fought fiercely, as if competing with each other. At that moment, a penalty was still being imposed on Chryses's body. Can you fight any longer? Chryses replied in disbelief to Yuan's question. Who would have thought I'd hear such words from a new player? It was a ridiculous story that he wouldn't be able to tell anyone. Of course, it would only be an embarrassing story if others didn't know about Yuan's existence. Maybe in a few hundred years, I'll be able to talk about today with pride. Suddenly, such a scene came to mind. I used to fight with Kim Yuan in the old days. Really, when was that? It was when Kim Yuan first came up to the first floor. Chryses chuckled and shook his head. He already found it funny to think about laughing and chatting with his friends about such stories in the future. Who would have thought that a ranker and a new player could fight like this? Of course. Whoosh. Chryses's flames devoured Yuan's flames. It's only possible if I survive here. Roar. The flames from all sides gathered around Chryses. The rapidly swirling flames rose above Chryses's head and gathered to form a sun. Yuan looked at it and muttered. You're prepared to be annihilated. Yuan felt anew how important this mission was to them. Indeed. So you probably put rankers on the first floor and sent out Aegis, even though it's a replica. If the Mr. doesn't join Olympus here. Sutsu. Yuan infused the black stone in his hand with power. The black stone, reacting to Yuan's mana, howled ferociously. The mana that started resonating grew so large that Yuan's physical body couldn't handle it. The next period of gigantomachia might not happen. Even for that reason, Yuan had to protect Hephaestus here. The second period of gigantomachia. That tragedy was something that should never have happened. Warururuk. Sutsu. The two massive manas displayed animosity towards each other from a close distance. The two types of mana, growling, clashed and created strong gusts of wind around them. Jutbuk. Yuan and Crexus. The two took a step towards each other simultaneously. The small sun created by Crexus fell downwards at his gesture. Pazuzu. Pause. As if disapproving of Crexus's actions, the tower inflicted a strong penalty on his body. The shape of the small sun wavered, losing its power for a brief moment. Quack. His broken teeth and blood rolled around in his mouth from how much force he exerted. Crexus squeezed out his last bit of mental strength and focused his mana on one point again. Goo! The flame gathered again, and the small sun regained its strength. Crexus's mental strength overcame the penalty inflicted by the tower at the last moment. That was the moment when two beings at the highest and lowest points of the tower, two polar opposites, clashed. You really are something. Amidst the clash of the massive mana, Yuan's voice could be heard faintly. Something. Qua. A giant gust of wind with scorching heat blew. Some of the players nearby lost consciousness from the gust of wind. What kind of uncivilized? The world of the first floor seemed to be howling from the clash of the two manas. The aftermath of the clash of mana and the penalty inflicted on Crexus had already turned the surroundings into a mess. The gust of wind continued for a long time. Agamemnon couldn't help but feel nervous. Who won? Crexus couldn't fight anymore. Even if he couldn't fight, it would be fortunate if he hadn't been annihilated by this one blow. It was hard to find a precedent in the long history of the tower for a ranker to use this much power on the first floor. Even if he hadn't been annihilated, Crexus's body must have been damaged so much that he wouldn't be able to use his powers for a while. The atmosphere was hazy with heat. The mirage created from the clash of the two flames gradually cleared up. And the next moment, both of you were alive. Crexus and Yuan's figures could be seen within it. Barely. They were, barely, alive, literally. Yuan and Crexus were lying on the floor. Crexus was alive, as could be confirmed from his body trembling slightly. Yuan seemed relatively okay, but even he could only snap his fingers, unable to move further. It was practically a draw. And Agamemnon smiled at the result. I won. Even though it was a hassle, Yuan had collapsed anyway. No matter how strong Yuan was, he couldn't do anything with his body so badly wounded. That was when Agamemnon finally became sure of his victory. Quang, an ominous sound. Agamemnon turned his head with a doubtful expression. And there, it's not over yet, boy. Hephaestus was standing there, holding a hammer with a very angry face. It was the moment Hephaestus broke free from his petrification. Chapter 43. Thud, thud, the sound of the air being torn. Hephaestus wielded his hammer crudely. The more he released his power, the more the tower continued to inflict penalties on his body, but Hephaestus did not stop hammering. It was an expression of anger. And that anger did not end with simply beating and smashing the void. Aha! Oh, he must be really angry. My ears. The surviving players recoiled at the sound of the crude hammering. Hephaestus' hammer felt closer than Agamemnon's sword. The pressure was so great that it felt like his body would burst if he took even one step closer. Fear. Even at this moment, Hephaestus' mana, which was gradually turning red, was already no different from a giant. I intend to ignore the penalty. Hephaestus was speaking now. He was telling them to come at him if they dared. There was no way that he, a ranker, could attack players on the lower floors like them right now. Even Hephaestus would not be able to handle the penalty if he ruthlessly murdered dozens of players. It would be one of two things. Either he would perish before he could kill all the players here, or the administrator would intervene. That was why Hephaestus was wasting his mana in the void and hammering away. Then, by using that, there was still a possibility. Hephaestus was not in good condition either since he had just been released from petrification. Then, by using the penalty. At that moment, Agamemnon saw Hephaestus, hammer swinging in his direction. Buzz. Zeezing. A blow that struck the void. And in that direction stood Agamemnon. Ah! The shockwave from the hammer strike hit Agamemnon's torso. Crackle. A strong electric shock of penalty ran through Hephaestus' body. Hephaestus stood there unharmed as if he did not feel any pain and slung the hammer over his shoulder. Unlike the other players, Agamemnon was a player from a fairly high floor. That meant that even though he had taken the first strike, the penalty inflicted on Hephaestus could not be that great. I don't know about the others, but I will definitely kill you. Clang. Screech. Ah! Cough. Agamemnon spat out blood and got up with one hand on the ground. His vomit was mixed with his insides. Hephaestus approached, emitting hot steam from his body. Penalty. He didn't seem to care about that anymore. Hephaestus had completely lost his mind. No, he might have known that he would not perish even if he killed Agamemnon. Ignoring the attacks of the other players, Hephaestus stared only at Agamemnon. Buzz. Hephaestus, hammer headed for the sky. He could not move. The overwhelming presence and mana. He had tried to catch this giant. I'm dying. The last moment, Agamemnon squeezed his eyes shut. Death was right in front of him. Quang. A heavy hammer sound that shook the atmosphere. Agamemnon felt his death. No, he had. The result was different. What the hell? Agamemnon carefully opened his eyes when he did not feel the impact. A large shadow was covering his body. Someone had stepped between Hephaestus and him. You're running too wild. The side profile of a giant who was 3 meters tall. He was blocking Hephaestus' hammer with his palm, which was as big as a human's head. There were not many who could block Hephaestus' hammer with only one hand, not even a giant with that size. Moreover, if there was an existence that could appear at this timing. Administrator. As Agamemnon said, Hephaestus had also guessed the identity of the giant who had appeared before him. The administrator of the first floor. In fact, it was not strange that he had appeared at this point. No, it felt rather late. Why are you appearing now of all times? When else did you think I would watch until? Hephaestus' complaints fell on deaf ears as the administrator snatched his hammer and tossed it behind him. The hammer, freed from Hephaestus' grip, plummeted to the ground with a resounding thud, creating a deep crater upon impact. If you truly wish to fight, do so above, not here. This is the first floor. The administrator rarely intervenes unless it is during an examination. They entrust most matters to the players, rankers, and guilds that inhabit the tower. The administrator typically only steps in when there is an issue with an examination. However, the lower floors were a different story. The floors below the 10th, especially the first floor, were of particular concern to the administrator. As such, the Olympus guild, which should have been managing the floor, was now causing trouble. It was only natural for the administrator to intervene since the guild had failed to resolve the issue. I had no intention of fighting. That is fortunate. The administrator turned his head. Agamemnon met his gaze and saw a vast cosmos reflected in his eyes. The administrator, the one who governs, controls, and, quite literally, administers a floor of the tower. He was an existence that rivaled not only Ares, whom Agamemnon served, but also Zeus, the king of Olympus. Are you from Olympus? Yes, that is correct. The administrator looked down at Agamemnon, who was babbling like an idiot, with pity. Go and tell Zeus this clearly. If he dares to pull such a stunt again, next time, I will pluck out his precious beard, just like last time. I understand. Do not just answer with words. Swish. The administrator bent down and extended his arm. Agamemnon could not dodge the approaching giant hand. If he tried, it felt as if his head would explode at any moment. I will be sure to do so. Screech. A black pattern was etched onto Agamemnon's forehead. Agamemnon rubbed his forehead with his hand, feeling the unique pattern that resembled a serpent's tongue. Hephaestus burst out laughing at the familiar pattern. Cuckoo. In this tower, the administrator's orders were absolute. Moreover, he had planted a firm imprint within Agamemnon's mind. If Agamemnon were to ever meet Zeus, he would convey the administrator's message without fail, down to the last detail. Even the part about plucking out his beard. Agamemnon looked back and forth between Hephaestus and the administrator, his face filled with despair. What could he possibly do, caught between these giants? His thoughts did not linger for long. Since the administrator had intervened, there was nothing they could do. This fight was Olympus defeat. It felt as if his body had been roasted by a blazing furnace. It did not take long for him to lose consciousness. He remembered struggling to stay awake until the very end. He also faintly recalled what happened afterward. The egg is baring its teeth. It was an absurd message. How could something that had yet to hatch bare its teeth? The egg continued to tremble violently within his inventory. As if it were trying to fight. Clank. Within the egg, engraved with a purple pattern. It seemed as if he could see something resembling giant teeth. He could not see it directly, but its presence was undeniable. This is dangerous. A chill ran down his spine, a sensation he had not felt even when facing the rancor. What in the world is this? Along with fear, Yuan was lost in a complex train of thought. Was it trying to protect me? What was the purpose of the teeth that the egg had revealed from within its hard shell? Or was it trying to devour me while I was weak? He could not know the exact reason. Before he could figure out the reason, Yuan heard another message. The egg has returned to a state of dormancy. The egg, which had been baring its teeth for a while, had fallen back asleep. The message was not something that had piled up while Yuan was unconscious. It was a message that had just popped up in Yuan's mind. Yuan realized that he had regained consciousness at some point. When did I lose consciousness? Yuan's next words were cut off. I'm what? A thick voice clearly reached his ears. Opening his eyes, Yuan turned his blurry vision in the direction of the voice. In the hazy vision, he saw a large soybean. Mister, look at this guy talking like a real parrot. As I've thought before, it was a voice that was really sleep-inducing. The vision that seemed to be covered in fog quickly returned. Yu-won got up and looked around. A small house in a slum. He must have borrowed the house of a civilian who had abandoned their home and ran away due to the commotion. When did you wake up? Look at this guy, that's what I should be asking you. Hephaestus made an absurd expression. A guy who had passed out unconscious was asking when he had woken up. Well, yeah, when Hephaestus had woken up, Yu-won was already unconscious, so they must have been worried about each other. Are you okay? I'm okay for now. He didn't know how much time had passed, but the burns seemed to have mostly healed. It must have been because of the increased resistance to fire and flames. What about you, mister? When are you going to stop calling me mister? I can't call you ma'am, can I? Hey, look at this guy. Anyway, thanks to you, I'm alive. Isn't the way I address you the least of your worries? It was a shameless thing to say, but he didn't really have anything to say. Hephaestus, who was taken aback, scratched his head for no reason. It was true that he was able to avoid being taken to Olympus because of Yu-won. Hephaestus hesitated as if he was about to say something. Yu-won stared blankly at his face, wondering what he was going to say, and soon his mumbling mouth opened. Thank you, yes, I said thank you, you punk. How many times do I have to say it for you to get it? Hephaestus, who had only said it twice, got up from his seat and coughed in vain as he said that. He seemed quite embarrassed. However, Yu-won thought that twice was quite a lot. You've worked hard. The Hephaestus that Yu-won remembered wasn't the type to express his gratitude with words. Actions rather than words. That was Hephaestus's motto and his way of life. But Hephaestus said it, thank you. He must have felt that it wasn't enough even with his actions. I'm actually not Volcar. Hephaestus opened his mouth with a grim face. I'm Hephaestus, the blacksmith of Olympus. Is that so? Aren't you surprised? I'm surprised enough. Can't you lie, or do you have no intention of lying? Hephaestus asked as if he thought it was absurd, then suddenly burst out laughing. He had expected it. He might have come looking for him, knowing that he was Hephaestus. The timing was so perfect that he even thought Yu-won might be from Olympus. But I know for sure now. A question he had always had inside him. Was Yu-won really from Olympus? If not, it was strange. Then how did he know him and come looking for him? If he was, that was also strange. Then why wasn't he trying to take him? Neither side made sense. However, this incident made it clear. You're not from Olympus, but you're not just an ordinary player either. He was definitely not ordinary. Even if he had been badly injured in his fight with him and had suffered a considerable penalty, a mere new player couldn't have won a fight against a ranker. I'm the type of person who has to repay favors or grudges tenfold, you know. He knew it well. Hephaestus's personality. Since the administrator has intervened, Olympus won't be able to come after me right away. So I decided to rent a large workshop in the city for a few days. A new workshop. He, who had been hiding in a small workshop away from Olympus, had gotten a proper workshop. Just wait a few days. Of course, the speed of his work was bound to get faster. I'll make you the best sword. Chapter 44. His recovery was faster than he thought. It was thanks to his high stamina stat and the healing potions that Hephaestus had given him. After sleeping for another day, Wu-yun felt his body almost fully recovered when he opened his eyes. I should be able to move around now. Clack, clack. He couldn't remember when was the last time he had laid down for so long. After lying down for a whole day, his body already felt stiff. I got into a fight with the ranker faster than I thought. I thought I would face Olympus directly after the 10th floor, but it got moved up. Wu-yun regained his senses and thought while stretching his body a little where he was sitting. But I got more out of it than I thought, so it doesn't matter. Hephaestus came out into the sunlight. Since the administrator had intervened, Olympus wouldn't be able to send rankers to the first floor and intervene too much for a while. It would probably take at least a few more years. And for Wu-yun, those few years were long enough for him to make a difference. If I can get help from that old man, I'll be able to get items much more smoothly. I was able to build a relationship with him faster than I thought. Sizzle. Wu-yun took out the clothes of the flame sorcerer that he had temporarily taken off from his inventory and put them on. Most importantly, it'll be a big variable in the second period of the Gigantomachi. Then, Wu-yun looked at the black gem in his palm. I've gained something. A lot. He didn't even need to weigh the pros and cons. The craftsmanship of the black divine stone. Hephaestus, the great helper. The ripple effect it would have on the gigantomachy. Furthermore, Olympus would have no choice but to watch the administrator's every move because of this incident. Moreover, he was going to be an enemy of Olympus anyway, so it wasn't that big of a loss. Only one day left. Hephaestus was not one to break his promises. A day ago, Hephaestus had promised Wu Yun 2 days. He said he would create the best sword. A sword made with mithril. He was looking forward to it. It was also thanks to the Black Divine Stone, but he never thought he would get such a good item so soon. As soon as the sword is complete, Wu Yun's eyes sparkled as he left the infirmary. I'll start the raid. Swish, groan, the monsters' bodies were quickly corroded by the mana emitted from the Black Divine Stone. It was because of the characteristic of the dark attribute mana. The completion rate of the 1,000-year frost had increased by a small amount. Wu Yun walked through the corpses of the gorilla-like monsters that were scattered around and looked down at the Black Divine Stone in his palm. It's not as easy to handle as I thought. Wu Yun recalled the power of the quina that Hades used. Compared to that power, the Black Divine Stone was nothing more than a firefly in front of the sun right now. Even though it was just a gem and not the completed form of the quina, the difference in power was too great. I guess it's the difference in the users. Even though Wu Yun had managed to draw a tie with the Rancor in his recent fight, it was only a fight on the first floor. Furthermore, Chrysis had suffered a lot of injuries and a powerful penalty from his fight with Hephaestus at the time. Is it still impossible for me to handle this properly? Wu Yun checked the status of the Black Divine Stone. True Black Divine Stone. Hash a fragment that contains the darkness of the beginning. It possesses an endless amount of dark attribute mana. Hash category. Material item. Hash can be hidden. Hash mana dark attribute conversion. Hash hell summoning limited. Number 50% increased resistance to dark attribute mana. Number 30% increased amplification rate of dark attribute mana. Number 30% decreased consumption rate of dark attribute mana. There were 3 major changes. First, the mark of unrefined state had disappeared. Second, the resistance, amplification rate, and consumption rate had changed. And the last third, hell summoning, it was the most noticeable option. Hell, it was a word that symbolized Hades, and it was also like the source of his power. However, as the limited mark indicated, Wu Yun couldn't properly draw out the power that the Black Divine Stone possessed right now. Still, he could now understand the true nature of the power that this Black Divine Stone possessed. The Black Divine Stone is not so much an item that possesses power as it is a medium that summons power. Hell, instead, Yu Wen didn't know what kind of place it was. Literally, it could be the world after death, or it could be the name of a world outside the tower, like another dimension. However, one thing was clear, the Black Starstone was an item that drew power from that world. Even so, I'm getting used to it. For a day, Yu Wen familiarized himself with the Black Starstone. In addition, through the battle with Chrysis, he was able to learn the maximum extent of his current abilities. It took quite a long time to start the raid, but he had gained a lot during that time. And just in time, Hephaestus, a contact from Hephaestus, who had changed the name of the player kit, arrived. A workshop on the outskirts of the city. Rumble, rumble. The workshop, with a long passage leading to a low ceiling that seemed like it would hit his head, was already filled with hot air. It was a pretty decent workshop. You must have spent a lot of money. Hephaestus seemed to have quite a lot of money saved up. Of course, the items he properly made would be worth tens of thousands of points, and some of the equipment sold in Olympus would go into Hephaestus's pocket, so it was natural. Maybe he was one of the top 1% richest among the rankers. It's quiet today. You're here. Hephaestus greeted Yu Wen with his usual greeting. With his impatient nature, he immediately handed over the prepared items. Here you go, a small case and a sword wrapped in black cloth. Yu Wen took them in both hands and shook the case, asking. What's this for? I mean, the sword. Open it. Quote. Yu Wen put down the sword wrapped in black cloth for a moment and opened the case. There was nothing inside. Are you kidding me? You fool. Take a closer look. What do you mean, take a closer look? As he put his hand in the empty case, he felt a smooth sensation. Yu Wen's eyes sparkled. He touched it carefully and could tell what shape it was. Gloves. Transparent gloves. Thin gloves made of special materials. It has excellent mana conductivity. It turns transparent through settings. The name and description of the item were brief. Special material, excellent mana conductivity. With just these two, Yu Wen could tell how these gloves were made. Did you mix mithril in it? You're quick. Hephaestus laughed lightly, as if he was happy. Mithril. The true power of that metal lay in its high mana conductivity. If you poured mana into a sword made entirely of mithril, it would feel like the sword had become a part of you. Yuan put on the transparent gloves. Literally transparent gloves, he had no choice but to wear them based on the feeling at the tip of his fingers. As soon as he put the gloves on his hands, I can't feel anything. Literally, he couldn't feel anything. As if he wasn't wearing anything at all. Why on earth did he make something like this? It wouldn't have been easy to make it transparent, and he even mixed in expensive mithril. He didn't have to think long. There's a groove. A small groove on the back of the glove. Yuan took the black starstone and put it in the groove. FS's. The black starstone clung to the glove. Soon, the jewel, which had been emitting black light, disappeared along with the glove. Transparent gloves. It wasn't a special item. It was an item to increase the convenience of Yuan, who had to carry the black starstone in his hand. I guess that's why you mixed in mithril. Yuan clenched and unclenched his hands, gathering the black starstone's mana in his hands. Despite the existence of the glove as a barrier, the black starstone's mana moved according to Yuan's will without any discomfort or awkwardness. It was thanks to the excellent mana conductivity of mithril. I guess I don't have to explain how to use it. I don't have time, and I didn't have the materials, so I made it roughly, so figure it out yourself. I'll use it well, don't say that until you check out the sword. Yuan nodded and untied the black cloth. A matte gray sword sheath. The length and shape were exactly the same as the, well-sharpened sword, that Yuan had requested. It's perfect, he could tell just by untying the cloth and touching it. This sword was really the best. Scott. Yuan slowly drew his sword. Its sharp aura shone on its own. Mithril was a mineral with a light green color, but a small amount of black divine stone powder had dyed the mineral completely black. It was a magnificent sword. Just holding it in his hand, the aura was transmitted up his arm. You name it. Blacksmith. Hephaestus asks for the name of the sword. Please name it. Yuan looked at the sword. He intended to name it after seeing the effects of a proper item, not just its appearance. Opening square bracket question mark. Not yet named. Hash a product of the blacksmith Hephaestus. It is made of mithril and the remains of a special jewel. Hash accumulates dark attribute mana. Hash maximum 200% increase in health recovery rate in the dark. Hash maximum 100% increase in mana amplification rate in the dark. Hash maximum 100% increase in mana recovery rate in the dark. Yuan's eyes widened after confirming the effects of the sword. What kind of recovery rate option is this? It wasn't fixed, but had a maximum limit in limited situations, but the amplification rate of mana and the recovery rate of health and mana were beyond common sense. In particular, considering the recovery rate of health and mana, battles in the dark could continue almost infinitely without getting tired. A sword that more than doubles its combat power in the dark. Plus, the accumulation of mana that the item itself has. This wasn't just a sharp and sturdy sword. It was a sword beyond expectations. Clack. Yuan looked at his face reflected on the smooth surface of the sword. His lips were slightly raised. Hephaestus, face brightened at Yuan's reaction. Have you decided on a name? Yuan nodded. A black blade. A sword specializing in night and darkness. I'll call it Black Knight Sword. You have acquired the Black Knight Sword. According to Hephaestus, the Black Knight Sword belongs to you. Attribution of the item. It seemed that Hephaestus didn't want this sword to fall into the hands of someone else. It didn't really matter. With a sword of this level, he probably wouldn't receive points and sell the item unless something special happened. Black Knight Sword, what does that mean? Hephaestus, who didn't know the language of the Murim world, didn't know the meaning of the name Yuan had given it. Yuan answered as he put the Black Knight Sword back in its scabbard. It's the sword of the Dark Knight. What the? Hephaestus, pupils shook. It was such an embarrassing name. Hephaestus, who was about to say something, closed his mouth again. Yuan looked at the sword hanging from his waist with a satisfied face. A face that didn't know what the problem was. They seemed to go well together. Hephaestus sighed deeply and shook his head. What could he do? It was something that he liked. Of all things, the naming is the worst. For him, who considered the completion of equipment to be finished with the name, his insides were burning. Hephaestus swallowed his complaints and asked, "What are you going to do now?" "I have to go up." An answer without a moment's hesitation. As if he had expected that, Hephaestus nodded. "I thought you would." Hephaestus' expression, which had been nagging him until just now, changed to one of concern. "What are you going to do about Olympus?" Hephaestus, who asked that, slightly avoided Yuan's gaze. It was because he felt sorry. It was because of him that Yuan had gotten involved with Olympus. And it was a wave that Yuan, who had just started climbing the tower, couldn't handle. He couldn't help but worry. However, what am I going to do? Yuan didn't look very worried. Was it because he didn't know much about Olympus? No, there was probably no one in this tower who knew Olympus better than him. If he asked what he was going to do about Olympus, he had an answer that he had already thought about a long time ago. I'm going to drag it down. Yuan pointed to the ceiling of the workshop. No, he pointed to the top of the huge tower he was standing on. From up there, to this floor. Chapter 45. Yuan came out of the workshop. He turned around and looked at the door of the workshop. There was no one to greet him. That was Hephaestus' way. In the past, he had felt that it was just bland and eccentric. It was later that he realized that it was not like that. You haven't changed, no matter when or later. It was a relationship he had met after a long time. For Yuan, who had fallen alone into the past, meeting the young Hephaestus was a really enjoyable time. Suddenly, he remembered what had happened with Hephaestus. I lost my sword. Oh, then I should make you a new sword. When the fight with the outer god was nearing its end, Hephaestus made a new weapon for Yuan, who returned empty-handed. Not to mention the strongest metals, such as adamantium or mithril, it was a world where it was difficult to find even one piece of common iron ore. Yuan wondered what kind of weapon he could make. However, Hephaestus had created a weapon that was even better than before. Where did it come from? The sword he handed over was made of adamantium. And as far as Yuan knew, there was only a small amount of adamantium left in the world that had met its end. And this adamantium was clearly. Did you melt your hammer? Hephaestus was wrapping his broken hand with a bandage. Yuan quickly figured out why it happened. Using the hammer he had as a material. And using his own fist as a new hammer, he made this sword. He asked why. The answer was still the same. Stop talking and take it. I'm tired. It was a hammer that he had been with all his life. After he became a ranker, starting from Olympus, he was recognized as one of the best blacksmiths in the tower. He never let go of the hammer in his hand. Hephaestus melted that hammer into a sword and gave it to Yuan. That's how Yuan received his heart. Clank, strength entered the hand that held the handle of the sword hanging from his waist. The steps that had not faltered with regret also stopped for a moment. Yuan bowed his head slightly towards the workshop where Hephaestus was. It was nice to see you. There were several types of tests in the tower. An individual assessment test that performs a set purpose. Similarly, there is a group test in which a group, not an individual, gathers to perform a given purpose. And a scenario-type test in which you find the correct answer in a specific story given by the tower. And the test on the first floor always proceeded in the same way. Name Kim Yu-won, a new player who entered the first floor 12 days ago. Long brown hair that reaches down to her waist. A beautiful female elf with a large chocolate bar in her mouth checked Yu-won's information, which was sent to her player kit. The tutorial record is the best ever. It is evaluated as S-class potential. Click. Ranker Shuri, who recorded a ranking in the 10,000s, raised the corners of her mouth as she looked at the picture of Yu-won on the player kit. There are a lot of good guys in this rookie. Some time ago, she was able to meet a player who impressed her for the first time in a long time. Pure blood of Olympus. Lineage of the heavenly throne. That bastard came in second. The bloodline of Olympus is notable in every tutorial. In particular, the child of the heavenly throne this time was known to have outstanding qualities that attracted the attention of several rankers. Naturally, Shuri, who thought he would be number one, couldn't help but be interested in Yu-won. An amphitheater for the first floor test. Yu-won stood alone in the huge test site, the Colosseum. I thought I'd take the test alone. Most players participate in the test by forming a team with similar skills, not as individuals. The reason was simple. It was a matter of efficiency and difficulty. The power of 10 players armed with various skills is not simply 10, but can be as high as 20 or 30. A well-coordinated team of players' tests are less difficult than tests made up of individual players. However, there is probably one reason why he took the test alone. Shuri looked at Yu-won, who was standing in the middle of the Colosseum with his chin resting on the armrest of the chair. Is there no one on this floor who can match you? A truly arrogant judgment, but Shuri didn't think that judgment was stupid. Rather, the judgment was very wise. A stage symbolizing the first floor. Colosseum. This place was not only the stage for the first floor test, which was held from time to time, but was also famous in the tower for its indestructible structure. This place was the first floor test stage that opened from time to time, and at the same time, it was famous in the tower for being a structure that would never collapse. Follow me soon. Even rankers came down to have duels. It's good because this test isn't complicated. Squeak. Yuan took out a new sword that was hanging on his waist, the Black Knight sword. The first floor test was a test of strength that asked if you could defeat a designated opponent. Of course, Yuan's pass was pretty much set in stone. However, the highest rank is Sun Ogong. Was it that guy? Ranking. First, Sun Ogong 19 rounds. Second, Hercules 18 rounds. Second, Odin 18 rounds. Fourth, Asura 17 rounds. Fourth, Yuan checked the rankings recorded in the Colosseum and nodded at Sun Ogong's record. Compared to his own record in the past, it was too high of a record. My old record was at the 12th stage. The monster that came out back then was probably Durian. There was no end to the Colosseum's test. No, to be exact, there was no one who had seen the end. If you defeated the first enemy, the next one would appear, and if you defeated that one, the next one would appear. New enemies continued to appear. Thankfully, you could give up in the middle or move on to the next floor if you defeated the first enemy and gained the qualification. However, since you could get a bigger reward the more enemies you defeated, most players who aimed to be rankers continued to challenge the Colosseum's test to their limits. 12th, Halgan 16 rounds. A welcoming name appeared. It seemed that he had let the other team members go up and continued to challenge the Colosseum's test. It's a pretty high record. 16 rounds was a record that only high rankers within the top 100 could set. I heard that he got the Thunder Emperor's hand, so his record is higher than before. He's climbing up much faster than I expected. He had already confirmed Halgan's abilities, not only in the tutorial but also in the fight against the Elyos. He was born with the talent to stand at the top of this tower and perhaps even become the king of Olympus. In addition to that, he had gained hundreds of thousands of points and an item called Thunder Emperor's Hand from meeting Yuan. It was like a tiger with wings. And that wasn't any different for Halgan's other team members. I'll hear some news soon. Halgan had started climbing the tower before Yuan. How many floors would he have climbed by now? I'll follow you soon. Starting the test. Defeat the given enemies. Clang. Along with the message, the door on the opposite side of the Colosseum opened. Screech, screech, clang. An orc warrior armed with heavy armor and a glaive. The first test given by the Colosseum on the first floor was the orc warrior. A giant over 2 meters tall. A muscular body covering his entire body. Unlike ordinary orcs who were just lumps of flesh, he was much larger and had a well-developed physique like a trained warrior. This Colosseum on the first floor is a test to judge one's skills as a warrior through the orc warrior. Screech. The orc warrior discovered Eugene. Eugene was already approaching the orc warrior. In his hand, he was already holding the Black Knight sword that he had taken out in advance. Kya. The orc warrior revealed his true killing intent after discovering the sword in Eugene's hand. And the next moment, Wang. Magic sword. Eugene's sword was imbued with black mana. Then, Eugene's sword passed through the orc warrior's body from his crotch to the top of his head. Scott. A soft sound. Schwak. The orc warrior's body was cut in half with his armor. Thud, thud. The orc warrior's body fell to the floor. The glaive that was about to hit Eugene's head rolled around the floor pitifully. The completion rate of 1000 slaughter has increased by 0.008%. You have passed the first floor test. Would you like to challenge the next test? Would you like to move to the next floor? A message popped up in Eugene's head. This was the end of the first floor test. For players who have the skills to defeat the orc warrior, this first floor test would be nothing more than a formality. However, the point of this first floor test was different. I challenge it. Challenging the next test. Starting the second test. Choo-choo-choo-chut. The orc warrior's body turned into black dust and disappeared. Then, the door of the Colosseum, where the orc warrior had come out, opened again. Thud, thud, heavy footsteps. Screech, quick, screech. The second test given by the Colosseum was 2 orc warriors. A test that was twice as difficult. And then, Yuan had already reached the entrance of the Colosseum. Beep. A black line passed through the bodies of the orc warriors. Screech. The necks of the 2 orc warriors were cut off, spraying fountains of blood. The completion rate of Cheonsakian has increased by 0.016%. You have passed the second test. Would you like to challenge the next test? Would you like to move to the next floor? Another message was heard. Yuan looked at the entrance of the Colosseum again and answered the question of the message. I will challenge it. Shuri, who was watching the test from one of the spectator seats in the Colosseum, couldn't keep her mouth shut at some point. When he first cut down the orc warrior, she thought it was just a fluke. Even when he cut down 2 more orc warriors, she thought it was possible. Even Hargan had done that much. However, the 3rd test started, passed, and the 4th test started. As the stage progressed, she realized what she was seeing at this moment. This is, gulped. She opened her eyes wider than ever and stood up from her seat without realizing it. Isn't this a historic moment? The innocent history of the tower. In the long history that could not be known, she had been in charge of the Colosseum's test supervisor here for thousands of years. And among them, the best performer she remembers is only one. He's faster than Son Goku. It was the high ranker, Son Goku, who was called the Great Sage, equaling Heaven Monkey King and the victorious fighting Buddha victory over Buddha. The one who set the highest record on the first floor test, the stage of this Colosseum. Yu-1 was passing the Colosseum test even faster than Son Goku. Thud, Yu-1's body fell in the center of the Colosseum. 9th test, a group of armed skeletons collapsed like fallen leaves. The test ended so easily again. Yu-1 hadn't even used any proper skills yet. He was fighting while conserving his stamina and mana as much as he fought without resting. He's not just minding the test in front of him. She was convinced. That guy is looking further ahead. Yu-1 was fighting the records set by the great beings of this tower. The records set by many high rankers. To surpass their records. The Colosseum's tests had already passed the 10th round. Chapter 46. Wereroruk. A crimson flame erupted from Yuan's hand. Fire Eye. Controls. Giant fire. Giant fire. Giant sword. Mana crackled. The black aura surrounding Yuan's giant fire grew several times larger. The blazing flames flickering in the center of the Colosseum instantly cut the body of the examiner in front of him in half. Tukwagagak. Sword met sword. Yuan's eyes glinted. Blocking it. Kagagak. The examiner's sword looked like it could break at any moment. It wasn't even a proper sword to begin with. It was nothing more than a crudely sharpened hunk of metal that was rusted and dull. How could he swing that giant sword so effortlessly? The fight was dragging on. I don't need to prolong this. Once again, Yu-1 gathered his mana. Wereroruk. Flames surged. In response, the examiner's piercing blue eyes erupted from the gaps in the old helmet he wore on his head. Goo. A crude mana erupted from the examiner's body. Quadic. Yuan's and the examiner's feet dug into the ground. Mana clashed with mana. The battle of strength versus strength had begun. Ududuk. Udeuk. Qua. The power of a giant fills your arms. Your proficiency is low. Your stamina is low. Partial gigantification is in progress. The power of a giant filled Yuan's arms. Check. The sword broke. Quajok. The examiner's chest was sliced open. It wasn't a clean cut in half like he intended, but it was a deep wound nonetheless. The tip of his sword must have reached his organs. Kiyu. Thud. The examiner fell to his knees. The helmet on his head also fell to the ground, the front part sliced off. Thud. Dekururu. The helmet rolled on the floor. The examiner's face was revealed. Brown hair close to blonde. Wrinkles covering his face and a single eye. Whether it was because of Yuan's sword, the examiner's face was cut and bleeding. If your sword was better, it might have been more difficult. That's obvious, but you would have won in the end. The examiner smiled wryly. Yu-1 didn't bother to deny it. It was more difficult than the previous tests, but it didn't feel like an insurmountable difficulty. He had used gigantification because he judged his opponent to be stronger than he expected, but Yu-1 had a few more tricks up his sleeve. It was a complete defeat. That's why he felt refreshed. This makes it the 2nd time. From what Yu-1 remembered, the examiner had only lost once in the entire history of the tower. The highest-ranking high ranker who recorded the highest ranking in the first-floor Colosseum trial. It was the great sage Heaven's equal, Sun Ogong. He was really strong too. It was the first time I'd fought an opponent who got back up no matter how many times I cut him or pierced him. But even then, it was a close call. The examiner looked up at Yu-1 while sitting on the floor. You're much stronger. There was a hint of respect mixed in his words. Yu-1 had certainly heard a lot about the examiner from Sun Ogong. That guy, he's really strong. Just his swordsmanship alone is probably better than most rankers. Sun Ogong was the only player who had ever defeated the examiner and moved on to the next stage. No other rankers besides him had ever made it past the examiner. Yu-1 had wondered why, but now that he had experienced it firsthand, he thought he understood. The difficulty is too high for a first-floor test. Even Yuan hadn't expected to use gigantification in this 19th test. That's how much the examiner's skill exceeded Yuan's expectations. And this wasn't even the last test. It's difficult enough that no one can pass. Yuan didn't finish off the examiner right away. If possible, he wanted to drag out the fight a little longer to recover the stamina and mana he had used in this battle. You plan to challenge the next one? Yuan nodded at the examiner's question. Yes, I'd like to watch if I could. The examiner said so with an expectant look on his face. The fear of death was nowhere to be seen. Perhaps, he knew that his death would once again become non-existent by the system. The examiner was different from the chimera creator. He was a tragic being who had been completely devoured by the system. A wall blocking the path to the 20th test. The nameless examiner's smiling face gradually turned pale. He was now slowly dying. Thank you, though. A longing lingered in the examiner's eyes as he looked around the Colosseum. He was truly a man who fit in well with this Colosseum. Thanks to you I can fight again like this so excitedly. The examiner's words stopped. The examiner died with his eyes open. Wu Yun reached out and closed his eyes. At that moment. Level up. Qian Salsung completion rate increased by 4.78%. Strength increased by 1. Agility increased by 1. Stamina. 19th test passed. Would you like to challenge the final test? Would you like to move to the next floor? Wu Yun's eyes flashed. Final. The 20th test that no one had ever cleared. That test was the final test. Even Son Goku couldn't clear this. Son Goku was the only one who knew that the 20th test was the final test. That was because Son Goku was the only one who had ever defeated the examiner who appeared in the 19th test in the first place. However, even Son Goku, with his cockroach-like vitality, had failed to pass the final 20th test. There were two reasons for this. The first was the injuries and exhaustion from the fight with the examiner. And the second was, would you like to challenge the final test? Would you like to move to the next floor? A message popped up as soon as the examiner died. Wu Yun did not respond to the message. He had shouted out a challenge right away just a moment ago, but he couldn't do that this time. He had used giant transformation in his fight with the nameless examiner. Moreover, he hadn't had any time to rest properly since he had rushed to the 19th test. He needed to take some time to recover and prepare thoroughly. This is the same as Son Goku. He was confident that he could pass the 19th test. The problem is the final test. The test on the first floor gives different rewards depending on how many tests you pass. Wu Yun is currently tied with Son Goku for the highest record, having passed the first floor test. As such, his expectations for the reward were bound to be high. Furthermore, there was the completion rate of Qian Salsung. 4.78%. The completion rate of Qian Salsung went up quite a bit in this test. The completion rate goes up when you defeat a being of a higher rank. One question that arises is why the completion rate of Qian Salsung is lower even though the nameless examiner was stronger than the chimera creator. Is it because of the boss setting? Or maybe the completion rate was higher because it took into account not only strength but also the ability to create chimeras. The criteria for increasing the completion rate were not known for sure. However, it was clear that his stats had increased considerably as a result. Qian Salsung Death Star, hash rank, A+, hash completion rate, 42.11%. 42%, it was a skill of A+ rank. The fact that it has a completion rate means that Qian Salsung itself is still an incomplete skill. How much more will it go up if I take care of the next guy? And how will this skill change once it is complete? He was lost in thought like that when, if there is no answer within 30 seconds, you will move to the next floor. 30 seconds. As expected, this damn test didn't give him any time to rest. Of course, if there was enough time to rest between each stage, there would be no point to the Colosseum stage where the next opponent would pop out one after another. In the end, there was no time to rest for long. Wu Yun answered just as the 30 seconds were almost up. I challenge it. Challenging the next test. Starting the final test. The final test. The moment that message appeared. Rumble, rumble, the floor of the Colosseum shook. The door swung open. A faint cry came from inside the door. Kya! Creepy, goosebumps rose on his body. It wasn't just because the cry itself felt threatening. The murderous intent contained within it. And mana. He felt it instinctively. That's really him. Yuan, who had been tense, held the sword he had been holding in one hand with both hands. The power of the giant resides in your arms. Gulp, thud. Mana swirled around the arm and sword that had swollen with the power of the giant. Yuan waited for him. The sound was getting closer. The shaking of the ground grew louder along with the sound. Finally, the boss of the last test has appeared. Kya, a giant mouth emerged from outside the door. Quack, the head that had peeked its head outside the door instantly charged towards Yuan. Yuan was rarely taken aback. It was so fast that he could barely make out its form. Quang, the head collided with the sword he had aimed forward. Blood, the hard scales shattered from the impact, and the hide underneath was slightly cut. However, Yuan felt his body being pushed back from the head that had charged at him at an incredible speed. If he hadn't put strength into the hand holding the sword, he would have dropped the sword. What kind of power is this? As he had used gigantification and waited, Yuan hadn't thought he would lose in strength to anyone. Hercules, the giant slayer. His skill was said to be superior to anyone in the tower in terms of strength, and on the first floor, he could exude overwhelming strength. But now, rumble, rumble, bang, Yuan, who had barely managed to hold his ground with his 2 feet on the ground, was eventually pushed back by the force and sent flying far away. Thud, thud, thud. His body rolled across the ground. Screech. Yuan hurriedly braced himself on the ground with his hands. Fortunately, perhaps because he had prepared in advance, the impact wasn't that great. After hurriedly getting into position, Yuan looked at the last opponent who had entered the Colosseum. Kya, a giant snake. It slithered into the Colosseum and swung its long tail around. Quang, dust rose up. As if enraged by something, it rampaged around the Colosseum. I had a feeling, but it was much larger than he had expected. Administrator bastard, he's really going all out. The tests on the first floor were planned and created by the administrator. Judging from the rankers who were overseeing the test, this probably wasn't a test that the tower had given of its own will. Although most of the tests in the tens were like that, this Colosseum test wasn't one that a player on the first floor could solve. Rumble, rumble crash, bang, the Colosseum's spectator seats shook from the impact. The Colosseum was intact as expected of an indestructible structure, but the sound rang in Yuan's ears. Buzz, buzz. Yuan stood in the middle of the Colosseum like that and looked at the master of the last test. Kya, it was long enough to wrap around the Colosseum once. A body several meters thick and a giant maw. Teeth longer and bigger than Yuan's height. That was the final boss of this Colosseum. It only has one head and tail, but hiss, hiss, ominous mana and oppressive killing intent radiated from it. It's definitely that guy. It was much smaller than he had known, and its mana and killing intent were lacking, but Yuan could be sure. At first, he didn't believe it. He thought that Sun Ogong had seen wrong, that it was just something similar. But now that he saw it with his own eyes, he couldn't help but believe it. Ki, a snake with 8 giant heads, each large enough to cover 8 peaks and 8 valleys with its body. More than a monster, it was closer to a divine beast, a demon, or even a dragon. It was born with all the world's anger inside its body, and it eternally wailed about it. It was definitely said to have been sealed long ago by Susanoo's sword, the Kusanagi. Defeat the 7-headed Yamata no Orochi. Chapter 47. Yamata no Orochi. He was one of the most dangerous monsters that Yuan remembered. The apex predator among the monsters that existed in the tower. The being that drove the high-ranker Susanoo to his death. And an ancient fragment of an outer god. To think that this guy was actually in the Colosseum. He wanted to give the administrator an earful if he ever saw him for setting the difficulty this high. Kya, the monster let out a roar filled with the rage that filled its body. All sorts of emotions, such as murderous intent, anger, and agony, poured in through its cry. Despite having only one head and being much smaller than he remembered, it was still a threatening monster. Boom, crash, swish, swish, no matter how much it thrashed about, the Colosseum did not break. Right now, it was just a big lump. In human terms, it was like a newborn baby. The Orochi erupted in even greater anger when nothing broke as it wished, despite all the noise it made. Cock, its cry echoed throughout the Colosseum. It was getting noisy. I guess I should hurry up and catch it. Whoosh, Yuan's eyes flashed red. At the same time, the Orochi, who had been rampaging inside the Colosseum for a while, spotted Yuan. Sheeing, the Orochi glared at Yuan with its long, flickering tongue. The murderous intent and mana pouring from its eyes were extraordinary. In the next moment, the Orochi, which had been still for a moment, charged towards Yuan at a rapid speed. Swish, crack, the Orochi's head slammed into the ground. Yuan dodged to the side and pushed off the ground. The head of the Orochi, which had come right up to his face, was truly menacing. Not only was it murderous, but the pressure emanating from its size was extraordinary. Size is a great power. Fortunately, it's just big for now. Yuan tightened his grip on his sword. And in that moment, Kwang, the Orochi's tail slammed down right above Yuan's head. Boom, boom, crash. As if it couldn't vent its anger, the Orochi continued to slam it down. Even though its entire body must have been crushed and turned into a pancake. How many times did it swing its tail like that? The Orochi I knew wasn't like this. Crackle, the Orochi felt an ominous energy above its head. Boom, a shock came from its head. Crackle, along with a black aura that devoured the light around it, the Orochi's head shook down. Kia, the Orochi struggled, screaming. It shook its head, trying to throw Yuan off. But even then, Yuan didn't forget to swing his sword. Crackle, true black divine stone. The black divine stone hidden in the transparent glove emitted light. At the same time, a black aura wrapped around the black knight sword. It felt different from when he fought against Crisis. It's much better. The energy of the black divine stone could not be handled with a normal sword. Most weapons that received this energy, which was difficult to handle on its own, would quickly corrode. But the black knight sword was different. The black knight sword was a weapon that Hephaestus had created using black divine stone powder. Since they were items of the same attribute, there was no way that the black divine stone's energy could corrode it. Yuan swung the sword filled with the black divine stone's energy with all his might. Boom, clang, thud, the hard scales and leather blocked the tip of Yuan's sword. The scales were split, and blood came out from the pierced leather, but it was still shallow. Whoosh, boom, Yuan quickly lowered his body to the ground as the tail swept over his head. The sensation he felt at the tip of his sword wasn't very satisfying. Only a little blood came out. But, swish, kia. The Orochi struggled in pain as the black divine stone's mana seeped through the gaps in its skin. Yuan frowned as he watched the Orochi roll around in pain. It's so damn hard. The scales and leather were much harder than he expected. Thanks to the power of the black divine stone, he was able to inflict some damage, but the wound he gave it was minimal compared to its size. He needed a different method. No matter how much it's the 20th trial, this is still the first floor's trial. Yuan's eyes scanned the Colosseum. The difficulty suddenly spiked up too much. It's not impossible to break through. Kiak, thwack, thud, kya. The wounds on Orochi's body grew in number. But unlike before, Orochi didn't scream or hunch over. Whether his anger was greater than his pain, he only chased after Yuan, fiercely swinging his tail. Boom, dust rose from the ground. Each blow was powerful enough to send shivers down one's spine. Phew, as his concentration increased, so did his physical exhaustion. At some point, Yuan stopped swinging his sword. How much time had passed like that? Yuan's feet, which had been dodging Orochi, stopped, and his crimson eyes stared at one spot. Found it. At that moment, boom, Orochi's tail fell over Yuan's head. It's out. Yamada no Orochi, the first floor's test supervisor, Shuri, rose from her seat as she watched the boss that had appeared in the Colosseum. As a test supervisor, she was not allowed to disclose any information related to the test to the outside world due to her contract with the administrator. Therefore, she couldn't inform the outside world about the existence that had just appeared before her eyes, even though she knew that the three-eyed were looking for the whereabouts of Yamada no Orochi. This was the second time she had seen that giant creature. When she first learned of Orochi's existence, Shuri had screamed in shock. Is this real? The 20th test was a difficulty that a first-floor player could not possibly clear. The 19th test, the nameless examination, was the same, but there was still a chance of winning that fight if they were lucky. But look at that thing. Its body was long enough to wrap around half of the Colosseum, and its fangs were larger than a human's body. Although it only had one head and therefore lacked one ability, it was still Yamada no Orochi. So this is as far as the new challenger can go. Shuri shook her head. As Orochi appeared, Yuan was seen flying away after getting hit in the head. As expected, there's no way to beat that. Yamada no Orochi was not an existence that a first-floor player could dare to challenge. And for good reason, the original Yamada no Orochi could instantly kill even lower-floor players just by making eye contact. Even Son Goku could not defeat that Orochi. Son Goku, who lost consciousness during the fight, did not die instantly, but the system considered him to have failed the 20th test because he fainted. His vitality was truly ignorant. A player on the first floor survived after being hit by Orochi's tail. Just give up. That alone is a historic record. A new player who passed the 19th test. It was the second time after Cheon Dae Seong, but that record would be recorded in the tower forever. That alone was enough. A player on the first floor dares to inflict a wound on Orochi's skin. Pggg, black mana burst from Yu-Won's hand. Shuri eyes widened at the mana wrapped around the sword, absorbing the light from all directions. Yu-Won seemed to be trying to continue fighting even after seeing that. Reckless. The incident happened the next moment. Pooh, kya, Orochi screamed as its scales and skin were cut. Mana seeped through the open wound and necrotized the flesh. Orochi crouched as if it were scared for a moment. Shuri was speechless for a moment. Orochi crouched down. No, rather than that. I pierced the scales and skin. A mere player on the first floor. A new player who had just finished the tutorial had pierced Orochi's skin. It was unbelievable. Kwang, kwang, kung. Orochi swung its tail without thinking. Yu-Won moved his body here and there to avoid the tail and cut Orochi's body with his sword. Blood, blood. The wounds on Orochi's body increased. Orochi no longer cared about the wounds. With only the single-minded desire to kill its opponent, it swung its tail and thrust its fangs. A series of thrilling moments that made the viewer's hearts sink. And then suddenly, at some point, she realized that Yu-Won was no longer using a sword. Surely Yu-Won's sword would have had the power to pierce Orochi's scales and skin. Why on earth? As her doubts grew, I found it. Yu-Won's feet stopped, and his closed mouth opened. What was he looking at? His eyes turned red. She was sure she had seen eyes like that before. No way, there was a single, great being that overlapped with Yu-Won's face. That moment, Kwang, Orochi's tail fell over Yu-Won's head. She didn't panic. This wasn't the time to panic. It was clearly visible in her eyes as a rancor. What the heck? In that brief moment, Yu-Won twisted her body sideways to avoid the tail, and at the same time, climbed on top of the tail. Tadadak. Yu-Won stepped on the gaps between the scales and jumped up on Orochi's body. Orochi shook its body to try to shake off Yu-Won, who had climbed onto its body. But contrary to its intention, Yu-Won did not fall and continued to run on Orochi's body. That kind of thing is not something that can be done with just stats. But what the heck are you trying to do? Yu-Won, who had climbed up Orochi's long body like that, quickly turned the sword she was holding in her hand upside down. After confirming that, Shuri realized what Yu-Won was trying to do. No way, that place. Soon, on the part of Orochi's heart, there was a small flaw where the only scales did not grow. Orochi's only geom, reverse scale. One unchanging fact came to mind in Shuri's head. No matter how high the stage of the Colosseum is, this is just a test on the first floor. The tower and the administrator never give a test that cannot be passed. Shuik, Yu-Won's sword pierced Orochi's geom. Pook. Orochi did not scream. Instead of screaming and groaning in pain, Orochi suddenly stopped making any sound out of its mouth. Caw-cack. The sharp, gleaming snake's eyes gradually turned cloudy. Orochi's body stiffened. It was an old story. A giant snake with 8 peaks and valleys covering its body, wielding mysterious magic and sorcery. The great disaster that had brought a floor to the brink of destruction was put to sleep by the high-ranker Susanoo. High-ranker Susanoo used a sword that never broke. There was a mysterious sorcery imbued in that sword, and one of them was the power to seal the being pierced by the sword. The name of the sword was the Sword of Totsuka. Susanoo left an indelible scar on Orochi's heart like that. That was the only geom that Orochi had, and it was the only way to pass the final test of the Colosseum. And now, right here, at this very place, the myth has been recreated. Chapter 48. Level Up. The completion rate of 1,000 years life has increased by 12.85%. Strength has increased by 1. Agility has increased by 2. Health has increased by 1. Opening square bracket, closing square bracket. You have passed the final test. Your achievements will be engraved in the Colosseum. Thud. Following the message that he had passed the test, the body of the fallen Orochi fell in the center of the Colosseum. A heavy tremor was felt through the floor. Wu Jin took a moment to catch his breath and check the stats that had suddenly increased. Name: Kim Wu Jin. Level: 69. Strength: 78. Agility: 62. Health: 70. Perception: 60. Magic power: 72. Available points. Opening square bracket, closing square bracket. He had leveled up again. He had leveled up after defeating the inspector in the 19th test, and even though he hadn't accumulated much experience, he had still leveled up. It's insane. Of course, the higher the level, the harder it was to level up. At level 60, he wouldn't level up much even if he hunted a lot. That was why most players preferred to gain strength through rewards from clearing floors rather than mindlessly hunting to level up. Even though the only rewards for leveling up were 3 stats, the rewards given for going up a floor were sometimes better than 10 stats. However, one could never become a ranker if they neglected their level. With this, I'm 31 levels away from level 100. The leveling speed was faster than he had thought. His body, which had been heavy with low levels and stats, felt somewhat recovered. Participant Kim Woo-jin. Woo-jin turned his head at the voice calling him. An elf woman wearing leather armor and 6 swords on her back and waist approached Woo-jin. Where had she come from? Her movements were so swift and stealthy that it was difficult to read her movements. It wasn't intentional, it was a habit that was ingrained in her body. A beautiful but strong face. Long, brown hair, a woman who liked chocolate. Shuri. She was a ranker registered quite high in the rankings. She was also a strong person on a different level than Crisis, whom Woo-jin had fought not long ago. She was also the test supervisor for the first floor. Did you know about the Yamata no Orochi? The test supervisor asked the participant a question because she was curious. Woo-jin nodded his head at her question. I knew. Then that wound is also. It's a scar I got from the high ranker Susano. That was enough of an explanation. Shuri was also thinking, no way, but when she confirmed it through Woo-jin, she was able to solve the question that had not been solved until now. A wound inflicted by Susano. Woo-jin had passed the final test given by the Colosseum by finding and piercing that wound. When did you first notice it? Because the tower's tests never give impossible trials. I thought it was too much for the first floor's difficulty, even if it was the 20th test. Woo-jin pointed to his reddened eye with his finger. So I looked closely, and there was an answer. Reddened pupils. It became more certain when she looked closer. As expected, she had seen eyes like that before. About 1,000 years ago. At that time, she was managing the first floor's test, and she was greatly shocked by a player. A skill that symbolized the current high ranker, Cheon De Seong. Are those the eyes of fire and gold? They're not the eyes of gold yet. Eyes of fire and gigantification. A player who used the skills of the high rankers of 2 different giant guilds. I thought that there would be great circumstances. I thought that there were 2 possibilities if possible, and this judgment was made by this test. You're one the side of the heavenly realm, Skyline, celestial realm, Skyline. Itis one of the Largate guilds that dominate the tournament along with Olympus. Itis also guild that once did not contain Cheon Dizong, but now does not. Or maybe successor to Cheon Dizong. Either way, I understand a bit now. Sure and odds, you gonna let their main misunderstandings. I didn't have to go to the trouble of explaining the misunderstanding. Anyway, I can speak about what happened at here. Is it different? Don't worry. Thetist supervisor cannot disclose the information such as the contents of the test and the players who participated in the test. Theorize no way that the story about you will come out. Ah, yes, and, Shuri took one of the many swords she wore on her back and waist and handed it to Eugene. Itis on additional compensation for the test given by the administrator. A silver scabbard with a red handle. Eugene took this word at the word compensation. Iced his word. When I became its supervisor for the first time, the administrator entrusted me with it. I was told that it was a reward given to players who had passed all the tests, but I thought I would never have a day to give it. Of course, who would have thought that a first floor player would be able to defeat the head of Orochi? Thanks to this, Shuri was able to take off one of the many swords she was carrying. Check it out yourself. I don't know what it is either. Eugene took out the sword and checked it out. The sword exuding uncommon mana was drawn from the scabbard. But, the sword was strangely broken in half. What is this, a defect? The test supervisor who gave the reward was embarrassed. Eugene looked at his reflection on the blade of the sword that was broken exactly in half. The blade of the sword was tinged with a faint blue light. Eugene's lips went up. It was here, Sword of Tatsuka, fragment. It is a fragment of the sword said by Susanuto Yamada no Orochi a long time ago. A special power is sealed. It is currently broken. You must collect the remaining fragments to regain its original power. The effect of the item itself was not very good. It couldn't even be considered a proper sword because it was broken in half. Originally, a sword was a weapon that could be cut and stabbed, but a broken sword could not be stabbed and was difficult to cut because of its short length. But that didn't matter. I had already acquired a usable sword, and the fragment of the sword of Tatsuka was not an item intended for cutting and stabbing in the first place. One of the 3 artifacts, the key to obtaining the sword of Kusanagi. The sword of Tatsuka was originally something that was supposed to be obtained by fighting the Sambujaja, as planned. However, since I got the other half of the fragment here, the plan will be easier. If you have any complaints about the compensation, please tell me. Even if it takes a little time, I will ask the administrator separately. I'm fine. Click. Eugene put the fragment of the sword of Tatsuka back in its scabbard and put it in his inventory. Anyway, I didn't have to use this item for the time being. This is fine. Really? Yes. Rather than an intermediate item that can be used on the lower floors, this is better. Besides, I know where to get the rest of the pieces, so it wasn't a difficult item to use. Besides, this is just a prize for passing all the tests of the Colosseum. The real reward was separate. You have passed all the tests on the first floor. 20,000 points have been acquired. All stats have increased by 2. Obtained, Sword of Tatsuka, Fragment. Obtained, Heart of Orochi's 7th. Would you like to move to the next floor? All stats increased by 2 points. A total of 10 stat points were given as a reward. For Eugene, who wanted to increase all of his stats evenly, it was a reward as sweet as honey. With this, his highest stat, Strength, reached 80 points. In addition, he also obtained the Orochi's 7th heart. Eugene looked at the glowing red jewel in his hand. This was the heart of the Orochi. A tiny heart compared to its enormous size. The heart of the Orochi was an item that contained a great amount of power. Orochi's 7th heart. This is the 7th heart of the Yamata no Orochi, which was sealed by Susanoo and divided. It contains a powerful poison. Unlike the heart of a giant, the heart of the Orochi could not be consumed by normal means. The Orochi's blood contained poison, and the heart contained the most potent of them all. It was an item that could not be used right away. However, if the poison could be neutralized, it would become a better elixir than any other item. The heart of the Orochi, I never thought it would actually be given as a reward. Shuri, who had been skeptical, stuck out her tongue at the reward given to Eugene. The heart of the Orochi was an elixir that even high rankers would covet. Needless to say, the value of the item was difficult to convert into points. Congratulations. As a piece of advice, don't just consume it. It seemed that she was still bothered by the reward she had given Eugene earlier. Of course, unlike the heart of the Orochi, information about the sword of Tatsuka would not be released at this point in time. I appreciate the advice. With those words, Eugene tried to leave the first floor. Now that he had received his reward, there was no reason to stay here any longer. However, the egg is reacting. The egg is appealing to its hunger. Suddenly, the egg that Eugene was holding began to vibrate. Suddenly, even though it was making a fuss about being hungry, Eugene didn't know anything about the egg. Normally, an egg would hatch just by being carried and warmed, but this egg was not like that. An egg that appeals to hunger. Even Eugene had never heard of this kind of egg. The egg reveals its appearance. The egg reveals its appearance. Eugene checked his inventory, which was still unresponsive. And sure enough, the egg was safely stored in his inventory. But then, the next moment, what the hell? The first to notice the strange sign was the examiner of the Colosseum, Shuri. She drew the sword she was holding and pulled up her mana. Eugene, who looked around wondering what was going on, felt a chill down his spine. Creak, clack, clack, the pitch-black darkness surrounding the Colosseum. And dozens of half-open eyes and immature teeth appeared in the darkness. Is it a monster that has broken into the test site? Shuri was wary of the strange beings that had appeared in the test site. But it was strange. The test site, a place protected by the power of the tower. She had worked as an examiner on the first floor of this place for thousands of years, but there had never been a time when an outside being had broken into the test site like this. But thinking about it came later. For now, she had to restore order to the test site, according to her role as the examiner. Swoosh, she swung the sword in her hand, trying to cut down the unidentified beings that had broken into the test site. That was when, wait a minute, she stopped the sword she was about to swing at Eugene's voice from behind her and turned her head. Please wait a minute. Eugene stopped Shuri's movement and looked at the strange beings that had appeared in the test site. Those eyes and mouths did not come from outside the test site. Those were, the egg consumes Orochi's 7th head. It was the egg that Yuan had. Chapter 49. Clack, clack, the meal was quick. Dozens of giant teeth pierced Orochi's scales and skin with ease. Like soft tofu, Orochi's body melted as soon as the teeth touched it. Shuri was no longer looking at it. She looked at Wu Jin and asked, "Is that also one of your abilities?" She didn't feel any special mana or murderous intent from the being that was eating Orochi's corpse. Therefore, unless it was a phenomenon that was visible to the eye, it didn't approach her as a major threat. However, that was why she was even more wary of it. She had become a ranker through endless effort and perseverance, trained, and gained the trust of the administrator to become a test supervisor. She had existed for nearly 10,000 years. Unlike her young and beautiful appearance, her age was among the oldest among the rankers. However, she had never seen such a being in all that time. It seems similar. If it's the same, it's the same, and if it's similar, it's similar. What do you mean it seems similar? I don't know either. At Wu Jin's answer, Shuri narrowed her brow and looked at Orochi's corpse, which was slowly disappearing. Anyway, as long as Wu Jin said so, she could no longer attack it. Wu Jin was the one who had taken down Orochi's head during the test's assignment. Naturally, he had the authority on how to use Orochi's corpse. Slurp, slurp, the meal was over. Wu Jin looked at the eyes that had grown a little bigger than before and asked. Are you full? The egg nods its head. The egg sings a song. Such a grotesque and scary-looking guy, but his answers were just like a child's. The egg's voice was transmitted through a message. Through it, Wu Jin confirmed that it was the egg he had. Okay, then, swish, flick, the darkness that had been covering it like fog disappeared, and the eyes embedded in it disappeared. At the last moment, the pupils seemed to be closing in satisfaction. Wu Jin checked the egg in his inventory just in case. The egg had grown large enough to be seen with the naked eye, albeit slightly. Opening square bracket question mark. Egg, hash this is an egg of. It is unknown who the egg belongs to, what will come out of it, or how to hatch it. Hash hatching rate, 13.58%. The stagnant hatching rate has increased. He had almost given up, unable to find a solution all this time, but a clue had emerged. Do you understand it now? After the commotion had died down, Shuri, who had been standing a step away, approached and asked. Yuan nodded and replied, yes, a little bit, a little bit. He didn't know everything. Shuri looked back at the Colosseum, which had become peaceful once more. The Colosseum was quiet, but it felt like a storm had passed. She, a ranker who had lived for 10,000 years, couldn't understand the players on the first floor. Her mind was complicated. Shuri looked back at Yuan. Actually, I thought you were the next Sun Ogong. It was a great compliment. To be compared to the high ranker Sun Ogong. Furthermore, she thought of Yuan as Sun Ogong's successor. However, Shuri's words didn't end there. But now I'm not sure. The Heavenly Realm and the Great Heavenly King. It was difficult to find a connection between those two and the abilities that Yuan had shown in the end. He wouldn't have been hiding such ominous powers in the Heavenly Realm. In any case, you seem to have a lot of secrets, but I won't disclose anything that happened here. I have no intention of doing so, and I can't. Thank you. I hope to hear news from you from a higher place. Shuri extended her hand toward Yuan. Yuan stared at her outstretched hand for a moment. She's still the same. It was her habit to say goodbye to the participants who had passed the test. Old-fashioned but upright, a strong and beautiful warrior. Yuan remembered the way she had died fighting in the last battle. Yuan greeted her by holding her hand. It was nice to meet you. Among the tests below the 10th floor, the Colosseum test was famous for being a test that measured the skills of players who had finished the tutorial and climbed the tower. The Colosseum test was divided into 20 stages. And as one climbed each stage, the difficulty increased sharply, and the rankings were determined according to the stages passed. Usually, ordinary players who advanced to the next floor passed the first stage and barely made it to the second stage. Usually, average players who go up to the next floor can pass the first stage and barely manage to clear the second stage. It was strange. Although it hadn't been that long, Yuan wasn't sweating at all. What's wrong with you? Yes, aren't you hot? Yuan shrugged. I am hot. Unlike his answer, Yuan didn't sweat. Depending on the physique, there were people who didn't sweat regardless of the heat, but with this much heat, it was normal for their expressions to at least be distorted. Hephaestus looked at Yuan with strange eyes. Just how high was his resistance to fire? Hephaestus, who had been observing Yuan's reaction for a while, asked, wiping the sweat off with a towel hanging on one side. Is the next floor the 10th floor now? Yes. This is the path I took after passing the test. It took you quite a while this time. Was it 10 days? 10 days. It was the time it took for Yuan to pass the 9th floor's test. In 20 days, Yuan had passed the tests up to the 8th floor in an instant. The floor he went up to like that was the 9th floor. Despite the sudden increase in speed, the 9th floor test this time took quite a while. You know what the test on the 9th floor is, right? It's been a long time, so it's a bit vague, but was it about finding the path of the labyrinth? Labyrinth. That was the test given on the 9th floor of the tower. It was a test to find a way in an endless maze divided into dozens or hundreds of paths, using various methods. Even so, isn't 10 days too long? Normally, it took 3 days for skilled players to break through the 9th floor's labyrinth, and at most, 5 days. 10 days was quite a long time. If it had been another player, not Yuan, who had taken that amount of time, they would have been considered incompetent. Did something happen? At the question filled with curiosity, Yuan's eyes turned into a crescent moon shape. With a playful expression, Hephaestus asked again, assuming that was the case. Answer quickly. I want to receive the item I requested. Are you threatening me with the item? Quickly. Hephaestus urged. Yuan didn't intend to keep it a secret in the first place, so he answered without difficulty. I opened up a new path. It took me some time to find them. A new path. Hephaestus, eyes narrowed. Of the labyrinth. Yes, you're saying that there's a new path, when there wasn't a set path in the first place. But there was no set path to begin with, so how can there be a new path? Chapter 50. Wu Wan received the sword that Hephaestus handed over. A dull blade. The weight was moderate, the shape and center of gravity were also well balanced. If there was anything lacking, it was that the mana conductivity was the worst, as Hephaestus had said. Unnamed sword. A sword made by mixing various materials. The mana conductivity is the worst, but the blade is well sharpened. It seems like it can be used for butchering. This was an item that could hardly be called an item. Even a sword made of ordinary iron would accept a certain amount of mana. No, if Hephaestus made it with determination, even a sword made of ordinary iron would perform much better than an ordinary sword. However, the sword in Wu Wan's hand now was not like that. In the first place, the things that went into it are used to make defensive gear rather than weapons. The fact that the mana conductivity is bad means that the resistance to mana is that much greater. In other words, it was a weapon made to intentionally lower the mana conductivity. If making an outstanding failure is a success, then it's quite an outstanding success. I guarantee it. The best failure. That's why Hephaestus could be confident that it was a success. Wu Wan tried to circulate mana into the sword. Mana sword is activated. Mana sword activation failed. An unknown force is blocking the mana. Ing. The sword shook finely. The mana that Wu Wan poured in was trapped inside, unable to come out. Soon, the sword sucked up the mana that Wu Wan emitted like a sponge. The skill had failed. It was certain. This was a failure. The best of the best. I like it. Clack. Wu Wan put the sword back in. It was better than expected. He had expected the effect of the skill to be drastically reduced, but he hadn't expected the skill itself to fail. If he had made this into armor, it would have been an armor with considerable resistance to mana. Pale, tar, obsidian, black iron. They really mixed in minerals used for defensive gear. Wu Wan was not a blacksmith. However, after becoming a ranker and fighting the outer gods, he had touched and handled countless items. He knew roughly what kind of items were made by mixing what kind of materials. This item was closer to an armor in the shape of a sword rather than a sword. Thanks to you, it was a fun challenge. I never thought I'd make something like this. Of course, Hephaestus had always made perfect items. Making a sword with the worst performance with such excellent materials was something he had never tried even when he first picked up a hammer. Wu Wan paid Hephaestus a total of 10,000 points with Asgard's check. Regardless of its performance, the price of the materials that went into the item was worth that much. Furthermore, this was a work of Hephaestus, no one else. Hephaestus refused, but Wu Wan paid him anyway. He couldn't keep getting used to freebies. I'm almost ready. 10th floor. The first wall blocking the players who had finished the tutorial and moved up. The difficulty of the tower's tests increased sharply every 10 floors. Therefore, players called each 10th floor, 20th floor, and so on, a wall. Of course, it was irrelevant to Wu Wan. The height of the wall that made ordinary players feel that way was much lower than Wu Wan's. Wu Wan found the portal located near the workshop. With 10 points and the qualification to pass the test, one could use the portal to move to another floor. Set your destination, 10th floor, a world where he had just gained the qualification to go up. I'm going to the Muram world, martial arts world. Qualification verified, moving to the 10th floor. Wow, the Muram unfolded before Wu Wan's eyes. Muram world, martial arts world. It was the name given to the world of the 10th floor. It was also one of Wu Wan's favorite worlds among the countless floors of the tower. A huge continent surrounded by the sea. There, the ecosystem of Muram Wulan created by the survival of the fittest was formed. Welcome to the 10th floor. The test begins now. Choose a school to enter. Pass the test of the chosen school. Unlike other floors, the 10th floor test begins as soon as you step onto the floor. There are countless schools, numbering in the thousands. The task of this test was to choose one of them, learn their martial arts, and pass the school's test. In other words, a test of training. The test here could not be solved by simply defeating enemies or carrying out special missions. The only way was to learn the martial arts of the chosen school. Of course, there's not necessarily only one way to pass the test. When Yu-won arrived on the 10th floor, he was surrounded by a bustling crowd. Hundreds of players gathered in a wide open space spanning hundreds of meters. Yongdiomant Dragon Sword Gate is recruiting. Anyone with passion is welcome to apply. Nangjiambang Swordsmanship House is recruiting. If you wield a sword, come to Nangjiambang. Chialungman Iron Weight Gate is a place where you can build a body as strong as steel. As you climb the tower, there is no martial art that surpasses our Chialungman's martial arts. It was like a marketplace. Countless players who had yet to choose a school wandered around, and various small and medium-sized schools moved to attract such players, shouting at the top of their lungs. The real powerhouses didn't come here, or if they did, they didn't raise their voices. In the first place, knowledgeable players knew how to find the real powerhouses. That was when it happened. Excuse me, sir. Someone approached Yu-won and spoke to him in a quiet voice. Is this your first time in Muram? It was obvious what his intentions were just by looking at him. Yu-won looked at the man with a sword on his back. He seemed to be a player from Muram who had settled on the 10th floor. Compared to other floors, quite a few players had settled in Muram. The reason was simple. It was simply because it was a good place to live. Yes, that's right. Oh, judging from your outfit, you seem quite skilled. Do you use a sword? When Yu-won nodded his head in response to his question, the man exaggeratedly exclaimed. What a coincidence, no, should I say it's fate. If you use a sword, you must come to our Kangjonman Kang Sword Gate. Our school is. For a martial artist belonging to a school, his way of speaking was closer to that of a merchant. Of course, Muram these days was much different from before due to the influx of players from various worlds. Yu-won ignored the man's words. Kang Sword Gate. It was a school he had never even heard of. No matter how much Yu-won knew, it was impossible for him to know all the thousands of schools in Muram. The giant schools probably aren't interested in a place like this. No, even if they were, they probably wouldn't come here in person like this. If it was a school that produced outstanding martial arts and skills, and high-ranking rankers, people would naturally come looking for them without them having to move around like merchants. Therefore, there was no way a giant school would come looking for Yu-won directly. There are a few aristocratic family-level schools, though. Yu-won wasn't interested in the Kang Sword Gate. He ignored the man who continued to chatter and looked at some of the members of the giant schools gathered in the square. The Mu Dangpa, Cheongsungpa, and Jegal family. There were also a few giant-scale schools that Yu-won remembered. But none of them were what he was looking for. The beginning of the Kang Sword Gate goes back even further than this tower. The man's voice droned on. Yu-won frowned and looked at the man. Of course, he had no intention of joining the Kang Sword Gate or anything. It was possible to change schools in the middle, but it was impossible to waste time in a school like this. On that side they're not interested in this kind of thing either, huh? Martial arts. It was the first hurdle that players who had grown stronger through tests, rewards, and level-ups had to face. A test where you had to move your body, train it like steel, and become stronger through training. Quite a few players who had never encountered a test of this kind had failed to pass the test and remained stuck on the 10th floor. So, the Cheonjeoman is hey, are you listening? The man who had been talking excitedly about the Cheonjeoman frowned and glared at Wu-won. It seemed like he had realized at some point that Wu-won wasn't listening to him. No, I wasn't listening. His face hardened abruptly. It seems you can't understand what I'm saying. I'm sorry, but I have no intention of joining your sect. Go away. Wu-won tried to get up and leave after saying that. But then, did you just ignore me? Me, our Cheonjeoman. The man's reaction was not good. Wu-won scratched his head. There was no big problem, so why was he being so sensitive? I didn't mean to do that, but... Wu-won, who had been thinking for a moment, nodded his head in annoyance. He had no intention of making excuses. You're not wrong. Bastard. Perhaps his pride was hurt. He glared at Wu-won and gritted his teeth. His face was flushed red. He pointed his finger at Wu Wan and cursed at him. You look so weak, and you're so arrogant because you were lucky enough to get this far. So weak. Indeed, the man was big. To some extent, he was half a head taller than Wu Wan, who was already big. He must have known that fighting with his size was not the way to go, since he had made it to the 10th floor and had even learned martial arts. Do you even know what kind of place our Cheonjeoman is? The man strode up to Wu Wan and created a threatening atmosphere. Still, it didn't seem like he was completely serious. The man was subtly exuding energy and showing his murderous intent toward Wu Wan. Even if he wasn't trying to kill him for real, he seemed to be trying to scare him and pick a fight. He can't be really mad about this. It was a classic technique. Picking a fight with a player who just made it to the 10th floor and showing off your strength. It's not a bad way for a weak sect to show off their skills. It seemed that he had underestimated him quite a bit. He felt like he had gotten himself into something annoying. He had to move quickly because he didn't have anywhere he wanted to go, but he couldn't believe he was being picked on by a sect he had never heard of. I don't know what floor you've made it to, but aren't you afraid of the penalty? Besides, if this gets out, it won't be good for your sect. There was an unspoken rule among the many sects belonging to the 10th floor world. Do not touch players who have just made it to the 10th floor. It was a custom that had been established when the Murim world settled into the tower and had been maintained for a long time. And any sect that broke that custom was sure to be punished. Whether it was by the Murim alliance or by losing the support of the people and making it difficult to recruit additional players. Either way, it was a kind of taboo for a sect in the Murim world to touch a player. Even so, there are rules in the world of martial arts. There's no way I can just stand by and let someone insult the sect I belong to. It's too late to beg for mercy now. No, that's enough. Thud. The man stopped talking as Wu Wan took a step toward him. If you don't want to talk it out, then that's fine. It was enough to persuade him with words once. Wu Wan's eyes changed. The narrower the distance became, the more eerie and chilling it felt. The man who met his gaze took a step back without realizing it. What the hell is that look in his eyes? He must be a player who had just made it to the 10th floor. But the look in his eyes, as they met, was the same as the look in the eyes of a ranker he had seen once from a distance in the past. What are you doing? The man who was looking at Wu Wan became nervous. Wu Wan's voice whispered, "Come in." Thud. Wu Wan took a step closer to the man. The distance between the two was now less than a foot. At that moment, gasp, bang, the man from the Cheonjeoman was startled and reached out to Wu Wan. Crack. Chapter 51. Kangjeonman Blue Sword Gate. The sect was named after its swords, which were said to resemble the clear sky. However, despite not belonging to a noble family, they were by no means a weak sect. They were a mid-sized sect with hundreds of masters. That was why Yang Won-il was proud to be a member of the Blue Sword Gate. Bring me 10 outsiders within 10 days. If you fail, you will be expelled. That was the punishment Yang Won-il received from the Blue Sword Gate's lord. He had gotten into a fight within the sect and crippled a fellow swordsman. In fact, the punishment was not that severe considering the crime he had committed. After all, if he could just recruit 10 outsiders, his crime would be forgiven. The problem was, recruiting 10 people was never easy. How can I bring 10 people in 10 days? In the current Murim, the prestige of a sect depended on how many players it had. When players who had joined the sect climbed the tower and became rankers, the sect's status would rise, and naturally, players would flock to the sect that had produced several rankers. Therefore, the sects had no choice but to focus on recruiting players. I'll do whatever it takes. Yang Won-il made a firm pledge and set out to recruit players. Getting a job at a mid-sized sect like the Blue Sword Gate was never easy. He had barely managed to reach the 10th floor, and he couldn't afford to be expelled like this. He had never done anything other than swordsmanship, but he was willing to do anything. Even if it didn't make sense, he would use force if necessary. After all, the level of players who had just reached the 10th floor was obvious. The accumulation of penalties was a problem, but he was a low-level player who had only reached the 15th floor anyway. Besides, once he had recruited 10 people, he would no longer have to worry about penalties. But, his vision blurred, and his thoughts slowed down. Before he knew it, Yang Won-il was lying on the floor. He didn't know what had happened. He was sure he had been the first to reach out. Had he fainted for a moment? When he regained consciousness, he felt the gazes of the spectators looking at him as he lay unconscious in the middle of the crowd. Gasp! Yang Won-il, startled, jumped to his feet, but his legs gave out and he collapsed again. What the heck is going on? Isn't that Yang 1L? Yang 1L, that loser from the Cheonjam sect. I heard he got into an accident recently. Why is he here? Is the Cheonjam sect leader greedy for foreigners? Maybe he ordered him to bring some foreigners as punishment. But why is he acting like that? Well, you see, earlier. Murmuring voices could be heard. Out of all these people, how could he collapse on the ground? It was embarrassing. Yang 1L tried to regain his composure and carefully got up. He looked around for Yuan, but he was nowhere to be seen. It seemed like quite some time had passed. Damn it, he clenched his fists. He tried to keep his expression neutral and pushed his way through the crowd. As Yang 1L lowered his head and hurried away, a face popped into his mind. If I ever see him again. Killing intent flashed in Yang 1L's eyes. 10 days had passed. Yuan had been moving without rest ever since he climbed the 10th floor. The martial arts community was great, but this was a problem. There was no proper means of transportation. Magic was advanced, but it wasn't as if there were magical creatures that could conveniently transport people. They had no choice but to travel on foot. This is crazy. 10 days. It wasn't a short amount of time. However, during that time, Yuan had traveled over 4,000 kilometers. From Wuchang, the starting point of the 10th floor, to Tianshan in Xinjiang. Since the distance was so great, it was bound to take time no matter how fast he was. This is Tianshan, a magnificent mountain and a clear blue sky spread out before his eyes. The grandeur of nature overwhelmed him for a moment, and he stared blankly. Yuan started walking again. He began to climb the mountain, and by the time he reached the middle, the sun was starting to set. Rustle. The sound of leaves brushing against each other reached his sensitive ears. Yuan turned his head. Quite a few people had already gathered. Who goes there? A voice filled with vigilance. The voice was transmitted through the forest using mana, perhaps to hide their location. There was only one voice, but there was more than one presence. The sun tended to set quickly in the mountains. In the darkness, Yuan activated his heavenly demon eyes. About 20 of them. Not only was their number large, but each of them was quite skilled. As expected of Tianshan, this place was a den of monsters. Don't be so wary, I'm not your enemy. It seems like you're not lost. Did you come here knowing where this place was? It was a question that had been expected. Looking at the owner of the voice who had been watching him in the middle of the forest, Wu Wen answered. Qiansan of Xingkang, the headquarters of the heavenly demon cult. Isn't that right? The two pairs of eyes met. At the same time as he answered, about 20 people appeared around him. Swish, whoosh, rustle, rustle, 20 people surrounded Wu Wen. It felt like a similar situation to not long ago. It was when he had just entered the tower and met the pack of jackals. However, the situation now was completely different. They're nothing compared to the pack of jackals. The heavenly demon cult, they were a group that had been opposing the Murim alliance for a long time. Even though they were in a state where they were unable to leave Qiansan, when only a single school was considered, the heavenly demon cult was not lacking in being called the best school under the heavens. And these people were members of the heavenly demon cult. You're well informed. The heavenly demon cult's martial artist looked Wu Wen up and down. It seemed like he was trying to look at his clothes, weapons, and the energy he felt. His general vibe and energy weren't bad. The heavenly demon cult's martial artist nodded at Wu Wen's visit. Do you want to join the cult? The purpose of players visiting the heavenly demon cult was obvious. Unless they were crazy, they wouldn't come here to fight, and almost all of them came to Qiansan in order to find a place in the heavenly demon cult. And the heavenly demon cult meticulously examined the players who visited to join. What floor are you? If you want to join, tell us your level and name, and a thorough verification of your skills. That's not it. Wu Wen shook his head. He had business with the heavenly demon cult, but if it was to join them, that would be wrong. Wu Wen didn't have the slightest thought of giving up the tower and settling down on the 10th floor like the other martial artists here. So he could say it clearly. However, those words weren't something to say to just a single martial artist in front of him. A much larger gaze that had been looking at him since earlier. Wu Wen faced that gaze and spoke. Player Kim Wu Wen, I would like to take the heavenly demon cult's test. After he spoke those words, a moment later, the heavenly demon cult's test will begin. Test of the heavenly demon cult begins. If you take the wrong path even once, you will fall into the illusion of the formation as the message says. The test of the heavenly demon cult began. It got dark quickly. The higher the mountain, the shorter the sun. Yu Wen climbed the mountain with the warriors of the heavenly demon cult. Thud, thud, the mountain was quiet. The sound of footsteps on the grass was clear. Among them, Kwang Ha-muk, the leader of the warriors, opened his mouth. It's been a long time since a player has taken the test of the divine cult. Kwang Ha-muk was a player who had climbed over 40 floors. He was that good, and he was also the leader of a single sword division. Looking at how hard you've come all this way, you must know why players avoid the heavenly demon cult's test. Because the probability of passing the test is low. Isn't that right? Wrong. Kwang Ha-muk shook his head and raised the corners of his mouth. It's not because it's low, it's because it's impossible. Quote. So far, no player has ever passed the heavenly demon cult's test. That's why the unwritten rule came about. Don't take the heavenly demon cult's test. Kwang Ha-muk looked at Yu-won. You might be different. There was no one in the Murim world who didn't know about the heavenly demon cult. There were two reasons for this. First, because the heavenly demon cult possessed a strong enough force to be considered the best in the world. Second, because no player had ever passed the heavenly demon cult's test. Because of that, their power is getting weaker and weaker. A sect where it was impossible to recruit new players. That's why the heavenly demon cult couldn't increase its power by any other means than accepting players who had come down from the upper floors. That's why this Cheon-san was so quiet. Long ago, the heavenly demon cult boasted a force large enough to fill this huge Cheon-san. This way, swish, swish, as he moved following Kwang Ha-muk's guidance, an ominous mana enveloped Yu-won's body. Entering the formation, resisting the influence of the formation. Resistance failed. If you deviate from the set path, you will fall into status ailment, hallucination. Formation. Although not as good as Zhuge Sega, who was known to be the best in the world in formation, the heavenly demon cult's formation was indeed great. The path that unfolded before his eyes looked completely different from before. There were dozens of paths, and he had to find the real one among them. The path that spread out before his eyes looked completely different from before. Dozens of paths appeared, and he had to find the real path among them. If you take the wrong path even once, you will fall into the hallucination of Jinbiop as the message suggests. If you take one wrong step, you will lose your way. Since Cheonma is not coming out in person, I can't find you either, so be careful to follow. Kwang Ha-muk turned his head to pay attention to Yu-won and stopped talking. Kwang Ha-muk's eyes widened. He's gone. He was definitely here just a moment ago. Now, he's gone. Where did he go? Kwang Ha-muk's head turned. All four sides were already surrounded by Cheonma Shinkyo's Jinbiop. If he disappeared from among these. Damn it, it was something that might never find its way. Thud, Yu-won moved his feet without hesitation. As he followed the path, another path appeared. Among dozens of forks in the road, Yu-won chose one and moved. In his reddened eyes, he could see the falsehood created by Jinbiop. Jinbiop wasn't that great. No matter how great Cheonma Shinkyo was, this was a world located on the 10th floor. Wan's skill was not so clumsy that he could not see through the Jinbiop of such a world. How far does it go? The path was quite long. He had already made more than 10 choices, and Yu-won had chosen all the real paths, not the falsehoods created by Jinbiop. It had been over 10 minutes since he started walking the path. It was time for the end to be in sight. Swish, the end of the chosen path. This time, too, several paths appeared. Yu-won hesitated. This time, it was different from the path he had walked so far. 2 paths. Both were real paths, not fakes. Which one? Yu-won trusted his intuition. It wasn't a fake path that would fall into Jinbiop anyway. The side he chose was the left. The choice was not based on mere intuition. It was the wind. Creak. As he took a step, the surrounding scenery began to change. The landscape of the forest-filled mountains narrowed, and a small room appeared. The room, lit by a single candle, was simple and quiet. And in the middle of it, someone was sitting with their back turned. You're here. A low, mid-pitched voice. That moment. You have passed the first test of Cheonma. The long-awaited message rang out. Chapter 52, Test of the Heavenly Demon. The contents of the message had changed. Not the test of the heavenly demon religion, but the test of the heavenly demon. I understand. A secluded group, not a single player has been allowed to advance to the next floor, or rather, they refuse to do so. No, perhaps it's more of an obsession. It's only natural that the heavenly demon religion would grow smaller and weaker as time goes on. But even so, when the Murim world discusses the world's best sect, they do not hesitate to put the heavenly demon religion at the forefront. The living history of the Murim world. An ancient high ranker who was alive even before the Murim world entered the tower. The heavenly demon religion itself. The heavenly demon. It was because of that one being's existence. Whoosh. Wind blew inside the sealed room where the door was not opened. The room grew dark. All I could see now was someone's back. I will ask you. The man did not look back. Only then did Yu-won realize. This place is different from what it seems. The place where I'm actually standing is probably not a small room like this. How did you know from the beginning? The test has been passed. I wondered why they had to set up a place like this. Are you curious about that? Including this, it is a test. The heavenly demon religion's test was just as rumored. Unlike the tests of other sects, the heavenly demon religion's test had no set rules or framework. Including this question as a test. There was a brazen side to it. The system does not lie. If this was a real test, a message would have appeared saying that the next test has started. But it didn't really matter whether it was a real test or not. It's not something I have to keep a secret. It was from the beginning. Didn't you see me before I entered the formation? The test started from that moment. The reason was simple. Where is there a test where you can just follow behind someone comfortably? Yu-won had heard a lot about the heavenly demon religion's notoriety. The heavenly demon religion that Yu-won remembered was a group of struggle and battle. For such a heavenly demon religion, and even the heavenly demon's test, to be just about following the path properly, it made no sense. Still, it seems like you're a guy who knows how to find your own way. There was satisfaction in his voice. Swish. The background around him blurred. The dark room became bright, and the narrow walls disappeared, revealing the scenery outside. The heavenly demon's back quickly disappeared. You have passed. A voice rang in Yu-won's head. The message was not heard. Kwang Hammock instructed his subordinates to guide Yu-won to his lodgings. The previous question was not part of the registered trial. It was a test conducted solely by Cheonma. Depending on the answer, Cheonma's attitude toward Yu-won would likely change. Qualified am. Either way, it seemed that he had gained some favorability. It seems I'll have to work hard to get on that old man's good side. Yu-won looked at the torches lining the long path. It was a huge town. Despite the sun setting and the darkness of the night in the mountains, people were bustling about. To think that such a town would exist deep in the mountains. This is Jade Heaven. Yu-won stood still for a moment, taking in the town. People were carrying rice, grains, livestock like chickens, cows, and pigs down the mountain, and armed men with swords and spears. Some sects of Murim say that demons dwell in Jade Heaven. Yu-won knew real demons. It was nonsense. Look. This place is a world where people live, just like Murim. While Yu-won was taking in the town, Kwang Hammock, who had entered late through the formation, shouted after spotting Yu-won. How are you here? He seemed quite surprised to see Yu-won return safely after assuming that he had fallen for the formation. Should he tell the truth? That he had just met the celestial demon. However, the celestial demon is a symbolic god of Jade Heaven. There was no reason to mention him. Besides, he hadn't even seen his real face or talked to him. I walked ahead. Kwang Hammock's eyes widened. Didn't that mean he had broken through the formation on his own? How? Although Jade Heaven's formation wasn't the best, it was impossible for a player on the 10th floor to break through it. Even Kwang Hammock himself couldn't be certain that he could get through the formation if he didn't know the way ahead of time. But Yu-won had broken through before them, who knew the path. That meant he had broken through the formation without much difficulty. Isn't that unimportant? Let's hurry. I'm tired from coming all this way. Jade Heaven does provide lodgings for those taking the trial, right? Yu-won said rather brazenly and began to stride into the town. Kwang Hammock was momentarily taken aback and looked at Yu-won's retreating figure in disbelief. He had been with Jade Heaven for 50 years. In all that time, not a single player had broken through the formation on their own. No, he had never even heard of such a person. Kwang Hammock had his men guide Yu-won to his lodgings. The next thing he found out was the name Kim Yu-won. He definitely had the skill. He had just reached the 10th floor through the player kit, so it wasn't that he had lied about his identity. If so, his name would have been somewhat known on the lower floors. Surely, if he asked around, he would be able to find out more detailed information. That was what he thought, but he didn't know it would be this easy. He was able to hear Yu-won's name right away through a few of his men. Yes, it seems like several large guilds above are trying to recruit Kim Yu-won. The Cheonma Shingyo had long since lost interest in the affairs of the lower floors. That was why they hadn't heard any information from the lower floors unless it was from a martial artist leaving Cheonma or a merchant going back and forth for trade. That was the reason why Kwang Hammock didn't know Yuwon's name. If that's the case, then he must have already made contact with the Murim. Murim. It wasn't just a name that simply meant the world of the 10th floor. The official name was the Murim Alliance. The Murim Alliance was a mid-sized guild that had several rankers. It was a union of each Murim sect and was influential enough to possess an entire floor of the tower. We'll have to find out more details, but that's probably the case. Even so, he came all the way here. That must have been quite the distance. I heard that he came up here after clearing all of the tests on the lower floors with the highest score. He even set a record up to the first floor Coliseum, so it seems like he wants to do the same this time. That's why the Cheonma Xingyo. No player had ever passed the Cheonma Xingyo's test. Cheonma hadn't lowered his standards, and unlike the other Murim factions, he hadn't adjusted the difficulty of the test. Plus, the threshold that Cheonma, the subject of the test, wanted was extremely high, so there hadn't been anyone who could pass. He really is something else. Kwang Hammock remembered the Coliseum on the first floor. He was born and raised in the Cheonma Xingyo. Naturally, he was quite skilled in martial arts, and he was able to clear the tutorial without much difficulty. Players who were generally qualified to become rankers tended to clear up to the 10th round of the Coliseum's test. Knowing that fact, the Coliseum's test came to Kwang Hammock like a wall. He first felt his own limits when he reached the 7th test. When he reached the 7th test, Kwang Hammock felt his limits for the first time. There's no other way. Cheonma Xingyo's test. Thinking of the reaction of the egg that had woken up after a long time, Yuwon recalled when he had just passed the test on the first floor Coliseum. That's all there is to it. After the tutorial. During the meeting where they discussed what to do, Cheonma Xingyo's test on the 10th floor was unanimously mentioned. The Murim Grand Competition is attractive when it comes to the Murim world, but the Murim Grand Competition is certainly attractive. If you win, you can even get a great elixir. Whether it's Shaolin or Namgung Sega, you'll be able to get the best elixir from either of them. But is there anyone here who hasn't won the Murim Grand Competition? Me. Are you trying to pick a fight right now? He recalled the memory of the commotion that had ensued. Yuwon chuckled. There must have been a few who didn't know about the Murim Grand Competition or who had participated but failed to win. Sun Ogong had made the most noise. As soon as Sun Ogong passed the test, he moved on to the next floor, so he hadn't been able to participate in the Murim Grand Competition. With his personality, he wouldn't have tolerated missing such a competition. In any case, Yuwon was also interested in Cheonma Xingyo's test. A test that no one had passed in its long history, even with the future that was to come. It's a shame that Cheonma died early. If he were alive, we could have found out everything. He's already dead. What's the point of being sorry? Cheonma had lost his life early on in the fight against the outer god. Kronos's clockwork had been created after Cheonma's death, so there was no way to ask him anything. In the end, there was no proper information about Cheonma Xingyo's test. I have no choice but to try it out myself. Yuwon didn't know anything. What this Cheonma Xingyo's test was like. Why, out of all the tests, was this Cheonma Xingyo's test so difficult? And, so what's in Cheonma Xingyo? Doesn't anyone know? I don't know. There's something there. We don't know what it is. Whatever it is, it can't be ordinary. None of us here have passed Cheonma Xingyo's test. Isn't it a gamble? It could all be for nothing. The tower and the test never betray effort and results. I don't know what the result will be, but it can't be for nothing. What they were hiding. Yuwon thought that finding that out was more important. If he really did win, what if it really was for nothing? However, opening square bracket single quote question mark. Egg is wriggling. It seemed that it wasn't for nothing after all. Long time no see. The unknown egg wriggling in his inventory. Recalling the reaction of the egg that had awoken after a long time, Yuwon thought back to when he had just passed the first floor Coliseum test. Chapter 53. The world on the second floor wasn't a very good place to live. The days were hot and humid, there was a shortage of food, and all sorts of monsters might raid the village at any time. Because of this, civilization was almost non-existent, and the only accommodations were cramped, moldy rooms. One fortunate thing was that the cost of living was cheap. He was already used to run-down, dirty places because of the long war he had endured. Wu Jin paid without hesitation and went inside. Thud, creak. Even so, when he lay down on the small bed, the creaking frame was noticeable. But Wu Jin didn't mind such things. His mind was so full that it felt like it was going to burst. The egg, the unnamed egg that slept in his inventory. After finishing the long tutorial and clearing all the records, he thought it was too worthless of a reward. Wu Jin knew two types of eggs. The first was an egg that produced a divine beast or a spirit beast, and the second was an egg that we ate or offered as a sacrifice. And this egg he thought it was the first type, but it was definitely different. The hatching rate was stuck at 0%. He was thinking that if there was no real use for it, he should boil it and use it to supplement his protein, but was it really an egg of an outer god? He guessed that it wasn't an ordinary egg. So he had a few thoughts. He wondered if it was the egg of a great being, like a dragon or a demon, the dominant species of the tower. But when he checked the pattern of the outer god, and even when the egg devoured Orochi's corpse, only then did Wu Jin become certain. Inside it lived a god that existed outside the tower. Wu Jin reached into his inventory. He took out the egg, which was now several times larger than before. Hey, opening square bracket dot closing square bracket. The system was silent. The egg didn't answer. It was the first time he had spoken to it directly. Wu Jin didn't know if the egg was pretending not to hear him or if it was still asleep. Are you sleeping? He tried speaking to it a few more times, but there was still no response. Wu Jin gave up talking and put the egg back in his inventory. As he gave up calling it, he recalled the sight of the egg devouring Orochi's corpse. Something black and enormous. Dozens of eyes and sharp teeth slumbering inside it. It probably doesn't really look like that monster. Wu Jin had fought many outer gods. Their appearances varied greatly. Some resembled animals, while others resembled humans. Some were so large that their forms were indiscernible, and they had multiple tentacles. But those weren't the truly fearsome ones. Rather, the most terrifying ones were usually the ones with ordinary appearances. The reason was simple: they didn't have a fixed form to begin with. They mirrored the emotions of their opponents, such as fear, and used those emotions to show their forms. Beings that were unknown and incomprehensible. Even Wu Jin, who had fought them for so long, didn't know everything about the outer gods. If those guys were here, we could discuss it together. Wu Jin rested his head on the bed. Zheqian De Seong, Heracles, Odin, Kronos, Asura. The faces of his many comrades who had fought alongside him came to mind. It was the result of discussions with all of them that he had returned to the past from the destroyed tower, and the path he was walking now was also a path that he had deliberated and researched with them. But none of them knew about the existence of the outer gods at this point. Of course, Wu Jin didn't remember either. Should I hatch this? The egg of shakes its head. Wu Jin frowned. He reached into his inventory and took out the egg again. This guy, until just now, it didn't answer when he called it, but it answered when he asked if he should hatch it. That meant it had ignored him. Wu Jin shook his head in irritation, which was rising up in him. He wanted to eat it raw or boil it and eat it, but he couldn't do that. Wuan thought about the egg all day. The egg trembled nervously. It must have known that Wuan could throw it into a hot fire at any moment. A whole day passed like that. Squeak. Wuan eventually pulled out his sword. Opening square bracket single quote question mark single quote. Egg is terrified. Was it because the hatching rate had increased? The egg had certainly been expressing itself more than before. It was only because it was using the system's messages, but in any case, the egg was definitely alive and breathing. Sorry. Wuan swung the sword he had pulled out towards the egg. It's a pity. Shuik. Opening square bracket single quote question mark single quote. Egg is screaming. An urgent message appeared. Wuan's sword stopped just above the egg. It wasn't just the egg that was nervous. Wuan, who didn't know much about the egg, was just as nervous. Wuan, who had stopped the tip of his sword above the egg, looked around for a moment. It was quiet. Nothing happened. Clank. Wuan put his sword back in its sheath and looked at the egg. Thinking about Orochi, the egg clearly still had the power to exert physical force. Nevertheless, it did not bite its master who was trying to harm it. It didn't know the difference between yes and no, but for now, it seemed more likely that it wasn't dangerous. For now I should just leave it alone. Opening square bracket single quote question mark single quote. Egg is wriggling. Opening square bracket single quote question mark single quote. Egg feels warm. The egg in the inventory had been sending messages ever since it entered the Heavenly Demon Cult's territory. It had been quiet since the end of the first floor's test. It even felt warm. Wuan took the egg out of his inventory for the first time in a long time. The hatching rate was still the same, so even after a month, the size was no different from before. Are you okay? Opening square bracket single quote question mark single quote. S-egg is answering. If you answered, you have to tell me what you said. Opening square bracket single quote question mark single quote. S-egg is nodding. You're okay. For some reason, it was the same as before. Every time, it just slept and didn't grow any bigger. Perhaps to increase this egg's hatching rate, some kind of power related to the outer god, like Yamata no Orochi, would be needed. Opening square bracket single quote question mark single quote. S-egg is falling asleep. The creature that had slept for a whole month uttered a few words and then went back to sleep. It was unclear exactly why this creature had suddenly woken up. However, it must have something to do with this heavenly demon cult. The outer god and the heavenly demon cult. I never thought there would be a connection between the two. I couldn't be sure yet, but I had a feeling that this test wouldn't be so easy. Did I enter the tiger's den? That was something I could find out by bumping into it from now on. A guest had come to the heavenly demon cult. The news spread quickly throughout the cult overnight. That's pretty interesting news. Someone who wanted to take the heavenly demon cult's test. The heavenly demon cult's test was an old ghost story, not only in the heavenly demon cult, but also in the martial arts world. The heavenly demon cult was in a place that couldn't be found unless you went looking for it, and even if you did go looking for it, you'd only end up wasting your time and going back. That's why players no longer challenge the heavenly demon cult's test. It was a kind of unspoken rule. Because if you challenge the test for nothing, or in the worst case, you could lose your life. A challenger. Is it the first time since Qianya Ryong? How many decades has it been? 32 years. 34 years. The four leaders of the heavenly demon cult gathered. Jiamxianju, Dakanju, Chengchunju, and Quanchunju. Each of them had reached the peak of the heavenly demon cult in their respective fields, and they were the main characters who actually led the heavenly demon cult. The Divine Cult Council. It was a place where the four heavenly lords gathered to discuss matters related to the heavenly demon cult. Usually, this would have been the time to talk about trading with the outside world and discuss major and minor events that had occurred in the heavenly mountain, but today, a different matter took precedence. It was none other than the appearance of a challenger who wished to attempt the heavenly demon cult's test for the first time in decades. Qianya Ryong has always been a staunch supporter of the cult, but who is that man? His name is Kim Yu-won. Kim Yu-won, you don't know, how ignorant can you be? No matter how deeply rooted you are in the heavenly mountain, you shouldn't be so indifferent to the affairs of the tower. I've told you time and time again. Enough with the useless nagging. Just tell me what he does. The one who spoke was Jiamxianju, the oldest of the four heavenly lords. Dakanju, who had been nagging, let out a small cough and said, "Well, the explanation about Yu-won was not very long. Other than the fact that he was a rookie who had climbed up the rankings of each floor, not much was known about him. A new record. His purpose is probably not much different from the others who have challenged so far. The only difference would be his skill. I heard he cleared up to the 20th stage of the first floor's test. I can't be sure until I see it for myself. Rumors tend to be exaggerated. Rumors may be like that, but the records engraved on the tower don't lie. Don't think like that." The four heavenly lords debated about Yu-won. The conclusion was unanimous. "Let's call him in and see for ourselves." That's right. No matter how much we talk among ourselves, it won't be as good as seeing it in person. Chengqianju nodded his head, his hand moved. At that, the numerous heavenly demon cult warriors who had been prostrating themselves in the hall raised their heads and answered. "Yes, sir." Thud, thud, the feet of hundreds of warriors echoed through the hall. At the same time, a large door opened, and a single person walked in. Thud, thud, it was a light gate that showed no sign of nervousness. It was hard to see him as being in front of hundreds of warriors and the four heavenly lords, who were the greatest giants of the heavenly demon cult. It was hard to understand such audacity unless he was a rancor, or a member of a dominant species like the dragons, giants, or demons. He seems to have a lot of guts. Jiamxianju and Dakanju nodded as they looked at the sword hanging from the man's waist. A sword and a dao. The two men, who wielded weapons of similar attributes, couldn't help but feel a greater affinity for Yu-won, who also carried a similar weapon, than the other two. Yu-won walked through the hall and looked at the four heavenly lords. Four men dressed in dragon robes of different colors. It was as if there were four emperors. However, among them, there was no Qianma, who was known as the god of the heavenly demon cult. Qianma didn't come, a chicken instead of a pheasant. Yu-won looked at the four martial gods who symbolized the heavenly demon cult. Sword, dao, spear, and fist. They were the beings who stood at the apex of the heavenly demon cult in each field. They were the ones who ruled this heavenly demon cult in practice, in place of Cheonma, who rarely showed himself to the outside world. He's the same, the one who passed the first test of the cult leader. Definitely, he's a bit different, but will he be able to pass all the tests? I have high hopes for him. The rumors aren't all that exaggerated. The four heavenly lords muttered as they looked at Yuan. Although each of them had different personalities and pursued different directions, their feelings were the same this time. There was no need to think further or reconsider. The four heavenly lords exchanged glances and nodded their heads. Then, let's start the second test right away. Wait a minute. It was then, among the warriors standing in the hall, a man in black stepped forward. Head of the Black Storm Unit. I apologize, but I dare to ask the Heavenly Lord for a favor. Cheon-ya Ryong, the head of the Black Storm Unit. He was a player who had taken the Heavenly Demon Cult's final test 30 years ago and was now the head of the Black Storm Unit. He looked at Yuan. Can I test this guy first? Chapter 54. There was a brief silence in the hall at Cheon-ya Ryong's words. This was because those who had to answer his request did not open their mouths. Cheon-ya Ryong knelt on one knee and prostrated himself, waiting for the answers of the four Cheonjas. A test. The first to speak after a long time was Cheonju. He looked at the other three. Let's make a decision as usual. Raise your right hand for yes. Raise your left hand for no. Good. According to the majority vote. The four Cheonjas raised their hands at the same time, without saying who would go first. Cheonju did not raise his hand. Dakanju raised his left hand. Changcheonju and Kwancheonju raised their right hands. 1 abstention, 1 against, 2 in favor. The result was determined quickly. Do as you wish, Cheon-ya Ryong. Thank you. Cheon-ya Ryong expressed his gratitude to the four Cheonjas as he took the lottery. Soon, the people in the hall stepped back a few steps at a time, creating a large, round space. Wu Wan and Cheon-ya Ryong. The two took their places in the center of the hall. Isn't this an official test of the Heavenly Church? Wu Wan, who had been observing the situation for a moment, looked at Cheonju, the leader of the four Cheonjas. An unprepared stage. Besides, the system still hadn't given a notice. Moreover, Cheon-ya Ryong, a player who was higher than the 10th floor, had shown hostility towards Wu Wan, and a penalty was flowing around him. This meant that the tower had not yet officially recognized this stage as a test. Yes, there can't be a test without a reward. So let's see. Cheonju thought for a moment and then continued speaking. Among the Heavenly Church's elixir, I will give you the red blood group. What do you think? Red blood group. A blood red elixir. It was a fairly valuable elixir among the elixir existing in the Heavenly Demon Church. It was not comparable to the Great Elixir, which was the reward of the Murim Grand Competition, but it was a higher value elixir than the Summoning Elixir. Among the elixirs that could be obtained in the Murim world, it was a pretty good item. The corners of Wu Wan's mouth went up. His gaze, which had been fixed on Cheonju, glanced at Cheon-ya Ryong, who was showing hostility toward him. That's enough. The stage is recognized as a test. Cheon-ya Ryong's constraint is partially reduced. Cheon-ya Ryong's penalty is partially reduced. Defeat Cheon-ya Ryong and earn his recognition. Fwoosh. The penalty of Cheon-ya Ryong, who had shown hostility to Wu Wan, was reduced. At this level, it was almost as if there was no penalty. It's about the level of the 30th floor. To defeat a player of this level. It was a fairly high difficulty for a test that was not planned and had appeared suddenly. What the hell is the real test like? He had only heard stories about how difficult the Heavenly Demon Church's tests were, but this was the first time he had experienced it firsthand. Cheon-ya Ryong drew a black sword and pointed it at Wu Wan. Your name is Kim Wu Wan? Cheon-ya Ryong, who spoke to him. Wu Wan nodded his head and answered. But, I heard you passed the first test. That probably means Cheonma Nim has acknowledged you. It seemed like the news of Wu Wan passing the first test had already spread within the Cheonma Divine Church. Of course, this many Murim people in Fort Cheonma wouldn't have gathered here just because he came to take the test without the proper qualifications. This place was probably created because Cheonma had ordered it. I don't know what Cheonma saw in you to make him pass you and acknowledge you, but it seems like he didn't acknowledge me. Wu Wan cut him off as he realized the conversation was getting too long. He didn't need to hear any more. You're different from me. Flair, who had taken the final test of the Cheonma Divine Church. Cheon-yang had a sense of pride in that fact, but he couldn't acknowledge the situation where he hadn't been able to properly take the test. Crack, Cheon-yang gritted his teeth. A comment that hit the nail on the head. But sometimes, the truth hurt the most. Unable to hold back, Qianyang attacked. Swish, Qianyang swung his black uniform and sword. Fast movements. Despite the suddenness, Yu-Wan calmly twisted his body and dodged the sword. Yes, I wasn't acknowledged by Qianma Nim, I, who swore to dedicate my life to this Qianma divine church. Whoosh, it was a fast and heavy sword. Mana, known as internal energy in the Murim world, flowed around the tip of the sword, increasing its lethality. I dedicated my life to passing this test. I trained my body and learned martial arts while waiting to become a player since I was young. I came back to this Murim world and challenged the test, but why? Crackle crackle, the penalty, which had a higher standard, sparked as he pushed his strength to the limit. Yu-Wan dodged his sword without retaliating. But you, an outsider, were acknowledged. Why, I can't acknowledge. You're not even a kid. Clang, swish, Yu-Wan's scabbard blocked Qianyang's sword. Qianyang's sword, which would have instantly cut Yu-Wan's body in half, strangely lost its balance and swerved to the side. At that moment, KWAAAK. Giant strength filled Yu-Wan's arm. Giant strength fills your arm. Partial gigantification is in progress. Zong, Yu-Wan's fist slammed down on Qianyang's back. Crack, boom, Qianyang's body hit the floor and bounced back up. He struggled for a moment before trying to get back up, but his eyes were already half-lidded. Thud, flop, Qianyang collapsed, his strength drained. Yu-Wan looked down at him, who had fallen to the floor, and continued. There's probably a special reason. Because you're weak. Qianyang had already lost consciousness. It was already an unconscious Tenryu. Nevertheless, Yu-Wan was able to subdue Tenryu far easily. The words he said some moments ago would have been heard by one or two people in the hall, so they would soon be spread. Yu-Wan looked back at the four heavenly lords, including Gumxianju. Isn't that right? Ha ha ha, poo ha 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 ha, you ha 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 ha. The heavenly lords erupted in laughter. Gumxianju, who had the most serious and quiet personality, smiled quietly, while the other three burst into laughter. Yes, it's been a while I've had such fun. I heard there was a script, but you wonder what would have happened if Tenryu hadn't been penalized. That's meaningless. Theothor hasn't drawn his word yet. Ice that so. The heavenly lords started to chat again. Yu-Wan waited for a moment to listen to their conversation. It must have been a while for an outsider to come and take a stint this way, so he'll let them enjoy it to their heart's content. Their conversations lasted for about 5 minutes. Gumxianju was the first to regain his composure. I'm sorry to have kept you waiting. As I get older, I talk more. That's okay. Where did you learn martial arts? I don't know which school you belong to, but the way you swing your sword is quite good. I was just copying. A smile appeared on Gumxianju's lips. His laughter seemed to be about to explode at any moment. Hey, bring the red blood pill. At Gumxianju's command, the attendant who had been waiting brought a box containing the elixir. The box was handed to Yu-Wan. As soon as he received the box, a message appeared. You have passed the test. You have obtained the red blood pill. The red blood pill became Yu-Wan's possession. Yu-Wan opened the box. Inside the box was a red pill the size of a fingernail. It's not a great item, but think of it as a reward for entertaining these old men. I'm satisfied with this much, since it wasn't that difficult. What? Poo ha ha ha. Qianju, who had the most boisterous personality, burst into laughter again at Yu-Wan's answer. Yu-Wan's words contained two meanings. The first was that the test of Tenryu, the leader of the Black Storm unit, was not tense at all. Yu-Wan meant that he had taken Tenryu's test lightly and easily from the beginning, like a child's challenge. And the second was that he didn't consider the elixir, the red blood pill, to be a great item. The red blood pill was definitely an elixir that fell far short of the great elixir. However, that didn't mean that the red blood pill was just an ordinary elixir. It was an elixir worth well over 100,000 points. It was an expensive elixir that players who had only reached the 10th floor could not even touch. Even here, there would be more than a few players who would rush in with their eyes burning if the red blood pill was offered as a reward. The reason they offered the red blood pill as a reward is because they need a reward of that level to weaken the restrictions placed on Tenryu. But Wu-Wan easily subdued the Qianryong despite the circumstances. The battle ended sooner than expected. However, that made the battle more interesting to the Qianju. Then, let me tell you about the second test. Qianju opened his mouth. The second test of the Qianma Shinkyo is to fight me, Qianju Kungbakrim. Qianju. Among the four Qianju, he had the most aggressive personality. Wu-Wan shifted his gaze from Qianju to Qianju. There wasn't much information about Qianma, but there was quite a bit of information about the four Qianju. Quan Qianju, a master of martial arts and a player who became a ranker after learning martial arts. The Qianju were all rankers. As the most skilled people in the Qianma Shinkyo, they were the de facto leaders of the current Qianma Shinkyo. Of course, it's not a normal spar. The goal is to withstand this Quan Qianju's Samsachosik. Samsachosik. At first glance, it didn't seem like a difficult test. However, the opponent was a ranker. He wasn't a rookie ranker like Cries, but Quan Qianju, the de facto leader of the Qianma Shinkyo. Quan Qianju is the weakest of the four Qianju. However, the power contained in a single blow is comparable to that of Jiam Qianju, who has the highest ranking. That was the general information about Quan Qianju that was known to Muram. Furthermore, unlike with Cries, this is an official test. The penalty was a force that existed to prevent players of higher levels from using indiscriminate force to destroy the ecosystem of lower levels. However, in the case of a test recognized by the tower, the range of that penalty was usually diluted depending on the test. In other words, the extent of the power that Quan Qianju could exert depending on the penalty was unknown. But if it's only 3 times. Quan Qianju smiled as he watched Wu Wan, who was lost in thought after hearing the contents of the test. Of course, this is a ridiculous test. I think so too. A test where one had to endure the Samsachosik of a ranker. It was too harsh a test for a player who had just reached the 10th floor. No matter how difficult the Qianma Shinkyo's test was, the difficulty level was unreasonable. Quan Qianju spread out 3 fingers. I'll give you 3 months. 3 months. It wasn't a long time. However, depending on how one used it, it wasn't a short time either. I will provide you with all the support of the Shinkyo, excluding elixirs. Training halls, solitary retreat, clothing and a comfortable bed, whatever you want, I will provide it. No, I'm fine. Wu Wan shook his head after finishing his thoughts. Quan Qianju narrowed his brow as if asking what he meant and glared at Wu Wan. Are you fine? Instead of answering right away, Wu Wan looked around. Thanks to the Qianryong's commotion, the Qianma Shinkyo's martial artists had already retreated far away. This was perfect. Let's start right away. After all, the stage was set. Chapter 55. There was a moment of confusion in the hall. Did you hear that? I did. Let's get started right away. I thought I misheard you. Aren't you scared? It's more like he doesn't know the power of the heavenly venerables. Unlike the Force Lord, isn't he a foreigner who doesn't know much about the Qianma divine cult? He might have misunderstood the rules. If not, he's incredibly arrogant. The gathered Qianma divine cult's warriors were furious, sighed, and were taken aback by Yuan's statement. And most of their thoughts were similar. You don't know any better, so that's why you're saying that. Kim Yuan. At Qianma Venerable's call, Yuan looked at him. You don't seem to know, but Quan Venerable is a ranker. Unlike the Force Lord who just collapsed. His voice was calm, but he seemed a little angry. Just because you defeated the Force Lord, don't you think you're being too disrespectful to our Qianma divine cult? This was the reason for Qianma Venerable's bad mood. It was because he thought that Yuan was disregarding their Qianma divine cult. In fact, it was a story that could easily be misunderstood, so Yuan bowed his head and apologized. I apologize if it sounded that way, but I never intended to disrespect the Qianma divine cult. Then, hold on, Qianma Venerable. Quan Venerable stepped between Qianma Venerable and Yuan. He stood up from his seat. Then, his height and size, which were much larger than when he was sitting, were revealed. You say it's a misunderstanding, so why don't you let him do as he wishes? He said that, but you could tell just by looking at his expression. It seemed that his pride was hurt. The aura surrounding him was not spreading out, but was wrapping around his body. It was wrapped around him as tightly as armor, and it was like looking at steel. It seemed that he was about to extend his fist toward Yuan and strike. That was when Quan Venerable was about to move his foot. Quan Venerable. Jiamqian Venerable's words stopped him. Stop it. Are you telling me to hold back after hearing what he just said? Quan Venerable protested. Even though there was a difference in power between the 4 venerables, they were all of equal status. There was no need to unconditionally follow the words of one side. However, this is a test given by the cult leader. Isn't it no different from the previous tests? Quan Venerable's face twitched slightly. Qianma. Now that the name had been mentioned, he had no choice but to step back. The name Qianma held absolute power within the Qianma divine cult. Moreover, Jiamqian Venerable's words were not simply to stop Quan Venerable. Only the cult leader can change the test given by the cult leader. 3 months. Keep that in mind. I was reckless. Quan Venerable sat back down. Even Quan Venerable, who was so prideful. That was how great Qianma's authority was. No matter how much of a fuss he made, it couldn't be helped. 3 months. In the end, time was given. It wasn't what he wanted, but it wasn't something to be disappointed about either. Yuan's gaze turned to the sword hanging from his waist. It's not bad. He had sat down, but Quan Venerable's gaze was still fixed on Yuan. His expression seemed to be brooding over something. Then, let's see each other in 3 months. Yuan, who was taking the Qianma's test, was treated as quite an honored guest within the Qianma divine cult. Also, the fact that he was not as clumsy as the players who had challenged the test long ago was another reason why he was treated well. Even the number of warriors gathered this time was proof of that. Rumors about Yuan had already spread throughout the Qianma divine cult. Hundreds of warriors had gathered to see such a Yuan. Even so, thud, thud, Yuan looked at the back of the old man walking in front of him. Jiamqian Venerable Shinmukuk. Sword Saint Shinmuguk. Yuan started to put the medicinal herbs into his inventory without showing any sign of apology. And why here? You must be looking for a weapons storage or an emergency shelter where martial art books are stored. The weapons storage is fine. I'll look for martial art books later. Are you saying that the medical center is more important than those 2 places? At Shin Muguk's question, Yuan walked toward the door of the medical center. At that moment, Shin Muguk saw it. The corner of Yuan's lips, who was passing by, was slightly raised. Didn't Qianma Xingyo say they would give me full support until the next test begins? Yes, if there were many players challenging Qianma Xingyo's test, this kind of exceptional condition would not have made sense. However, Yuan was the first challenger to appear in decades. Maybe because of that, Qianma offered quite exceptional conditions for this test. He told them not to spare any support except for elixirs and high-grade emergency supplies. When Yuan heard the news of the support, one thing came to mind right away. Those words. Creak. As the door of the medical center opened, a strong smell of medicinal herbs wafted out. You'll probably regret it. This is all. The head of the medical center of Qianma Xingyo's headquarters. Jin Ilwan was very surprised after gathering the medicinal herbs that Yuan had chosen. Not only that, the other medical staff working under him were the same. They had spent half a day carrying the herbs out of the warehouse at Yuan's request. There were probably hundreds of pounds of medicinal herbs. Even just in terms of quantity, it was probably half of the medicinal herbs that the medical center had in stock. Furthermore, except for the medicines that belonged to the elixir, almost all of the medical center's medicines were gathered here, excluding the lower-grade medicines. Yes, I'll take it. Without any hint of guilt, Yuan started putting the medicinal herbs into his inventory. Head apothecary Jin Ilwan had a look of bewilderment in his face, but he couldn't say anything. It was because of Qianma's orders. Spare no support except for healing potions and high-level supplies. It was hard to tell why such an order was given. However, the warriors of the heavenly demon cult didn't think much of the order. Healing potions and supplies. Excluding those 2, there was nothing else that could be considered support. Weapons could only be borrowed for a few months, and other than high-level supplies, there wasn't much difference from what was provided to ordinary priests. Training grounds, food, a small amount of medicinal herbs, and lower-level martial arts manuals. He thought that would be all that could be supported. Why do you need this much medicine? With this much medicine, the heavenly demon cult could go to war with the Murim Alliance. It didn't make sense that an individual, and for only 3 months, would use this much. Naturally, Jin Ilwan thought that Yuan's request was unreasonable. Let me say it again, you must return the remaining medicine after 3 months. And if the medicine is damaged even though you didn't use it yourself, I have to pay for it with my own money. I remember that clearly. In the meantime, Yuan had put all the medicinal herbs into his inventory. It was an inventory that he had bought for quite a high price. It was spacious, and the weight reduction rate was just as great. And yet, the inventory was almost full. It's quite a lot. Yuan, who had emptied the clinic, was guided by Sivi. He ignored what sounded like the head apothecary's screams behind him. All hearing a lot of crying in 3 months. He thought that he should have left some behind, but he soon shook his head. The belt around his waist. The high-level inventory had become so heavy, but in truth, he wasn't comfortable with even this much. This might not be enough either. The place he was guided to by Sivi was a cave halfway up Qianma Mountain. The entrance wasn't very high, around 2 meters. However, the inside was a large cavity, and it was a training ground practice cave full of training equipment. Wivereved, thank you, and this. Sivi handed Yuan a torch soaked in oil. Yuan lit the torch and entered the training ground. As he lit fires all over the training ground, the interior of the training ground, which had been pitch black, became bright. Warururuk, Waruk, a long cave. As he went deeper, a training ground with a diameter of at least a few hundred meters appeared. Training equipment piled up on one side. In that brief moment of admiration. Goo 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 goo, Dururuk, Kung, the entrance to the training ground closed. Perhaps that entrance would only open again in 3 months. It could only be closed from the outside, and it could only be opened from the inside. No one but Yuan could open that door now. Unless they break it, it was the perfect place to train without any interruptions. Furthermore, this is perfect for taking this. Yuan reached into his inventory. Inside the inventory, something hard like a jewel was caught at the tip of his finger. Orochi's 7th heart. This is the 7th heart of the Yamata no Orochi, which was sealed and divided by Susanoo. It contains a powerful poison. Orochi's heart. It was a reward for passing the first floor Colosseum, an item he hadn't been able to touch until now. There was one reason. It contains a powerful poison. It was because of the poison that Orochi's heart contained. It was an extremely strong poison that couldn't be consumed without a powerful antidote. That was the toxicity of Orochi's heart. However, I wondered where I would get the antidote and consume it. Yuan looked at the medicinal herbs that filled his inventory and laughed. I guess I'll be getting high here. Chapter 56. Boom, rumble, rumble, thud. The peaks of the heavenly demon temple shook. Chunyeryong trembled at the vibrations coming from the ground. It seems like the sovereign of power is quite angry. Whether the heavenly demon favors him or not, it seems like he intends to completely crush this challenger. Kwang Hammock, who was next to him, looked at one of the peaks of the heavenly mountain. The sovereign of power was the most belligerent of the 4 sovereigns. It was natural for him to warm up before a fight. But this time, there were some other emotions mixed in. But it's still just Andal. Then did that kid step on you? Cough. Kwang Hammock burst out laughing at Chunyeryong's question. It seemed like he was recalling the sparring match between Chunyeryong and Yuan. Well, he's not just any kid. How can that guy be so strong when he's only climbed 10 floors? Isn't he fundamentally different from us? Even if he is a pureblood. Chunyeryong and Kwang Hammock were players. Although they had given up on the tower now, they were once purebloods from the Murim world who received attention. They couldn't compare to purebloods from large guilds like Olympus, Heaven, or Asgard, but they were quite proud of their origins. But, isn't the difference too big? Chunyeryong recalled his sparring match with Yuan. No, that wasn't sparring. It was one-sided violence, to say the least. With the restrictions of the stage play penalty mostly gone, Chunyeryong was instantly subdued by Yuan. Kwang Hammock, who was present at the scene, also clearly remembered what happened then. He was just as shocked as Chunyeryong, if not more. So what do you think? Boom, rumble, the ground shook once again. The sovereign of power's attack shook the peak of the heavenly mountain. As his fist gathered, the mana that grew thicker seemed to flow into the inner sanctum of the heavenly demon temple. Do you think that guy can withstand that? The sovereign of power's attack was being transmitted throughout their bodies even now. Although he was the weakest of the 4 sovereigns, a rancor was still a rancor. No matter how great of a person they were, it wouldn't be easy to endure the sovereign of power's 3-second ritual, who had reached the top of the tower. Well, Chunyeryong pondered for quite a while. Yuan and the sovereign of power. A reckless test to endure a rancor's 3-second ritual. Drip, drip, Yuan chewed on the herbs for a while. A bitter taste filled his mouth. He wondered if he should have brought some honey, but that would have only weakened the effects of the medicine. After gagging a few times, Yuan stopped taking the herbs. This is disgusting. He felt like it would have been better to get stabbed by a sword in a fight. He didn't know there were so many different kinds of bitter tastes. It was the first time even for Yuan to ingest this many different types of medicine at once. Green dragon grass has been consumed. Resistance to poison has slightly increased for 24.1 hours. Poisoned radish has been consumed. Resistance to poison has increased for 21.4 hours. Half-touch flower has been consumed. Resistance to 98 different types of poison has been created for 45.7 hours. All sorts of herbs, and even various antidotes created by the Cheonma Divine Church. Yuan stuffed himself with them until he could eat no more, and his expression crumpled up. Now, his insides were churning due to the effects of the herbs. Did some of them mix and become poison? Medicine, in principle, was not to be ingested carelessly without a doctor's advice. The reason was simple, because medicine, if taken incorrectly, could easily become poison. Creating poison by mixing different types of medicine was a method commonly used by the Sichuan Tang family, a renowned family of poison experts. It can't be helped. I don't know every medicine out there. Just in case, he had asked the head physician about any combinations of medicine to watch out for. Thanks to that, he had not taken any fatal combinations together, but it seemed that even the head physician had not considered the possibility of ingesting this number of medicines at once. Some of the medicines he had ingested reacted like poison. Fortunately, it was only to the extent of causing an upset stomach. Well, whatever. Yu-Wan picked up today's main dish, which he had set aside for the end. That's something you should do when you're all fighting each other. Opening square bracket single quote question mark single quote. Egg opens its mouth. He could feel the egg in his inventory moving. Yu-Wan frowned. Again, you can't have this. Opening square bracket single quote question mark single quote. Egg looks on with curiosity. You can't have it, no matter what. Or else you'll regret it. Opening square bracket single quote question mark single quote. Egg is startled. Opening square bracket single quote question mark single quote. Egg goes back to sleep. Whether it was because the threat worked or not, the egg gave up on the heart of the Orochi and went back to sleep. Something like this had happened once before. As he was contemplating how to consume the heart of the Orochi, the egg had tried to swallow the heart whole. Thanks to him warning it firmly not to do that again, it didn't try to sink its teeth into it straight away, but he was still wary. That should do it. It seemed that his lifespan had decreased because of the egg, which he had saved unexpectedly. Yu-Wan looked around furtively, as if he were secretly eating a packed lunch. Soon, Yu-Wan brought the heart up to his mouth. Crunch. The hard heart was crushed by Yu-Wan's teeth. His mouth felt like it was on fire. Yu-Wan chewed and swallowed the heart in an instant. Orochi's seventh heart has been consumed. Orochi's poison spreads through your body. Poison resistance status effect, resisting poisoning. Poison resistance status effect, resisting poisoning. Poison resistance. Messages rang out endlessly. And along with them, failed to resist Orochi's poison. Status effect, poisoning begins. Status effect, poisoning stage 2. Yu-Wan's entire body was in pain as if his skin and flesh were burning from the Orochi's poison spreading through him. Q. Gulp, gulp, gulp. Yu-Wan barely stretched out his arm and put the herbs in his mouth to chew on them. Poison resistance status effect, resists abnormal status, poisoned. Poison resistance has increased by 1. He didn't know how many times he had heard this message. The increased poison resistance alone must have been in the dozens. At this rate, he probably wouldn't even feel the effects of any other poison. But even with his increased resistance, it was useless against the Orochi's poison. Although there was one effect. The pain has decreased slightly. The pain from the poison was gradually decreasing, even if it was only by a little. He should be satisfied with this much. Still, the more his resistance to the poison increased, the slower the poison spread, and the stronger the effect of the herbs became. Phew. Yu-Wan, who had been lying face down and barely reaching out his hand to find and eat the herbs, managed to turn his body over. It still felt like a fire was burning in his stomach, but what was this? Yu-Wan, who had put an unknown root in his mouth and was chewing on it, felt his paralyzed eyes slowly begin to open. Mana has increased by 1. Mana has increased by 1. Stats that increased along with his poison resistance. The rate of increase in mana was unusual. It's increasing faster than I thought. Yu-Wan's current mana stat was 88. It was a stat that he had achieved by increasing the completion rate of the 1,000-year-old tree, leveling up, and climbing the tower. The higher the stat, the harder it was to increase. That was why once you increased your stats to a certain level, it became difficult to increase them without leveling up. That's why Yu-Wan considered increasing his stats through methods like elixirs a top priority over leveling up. In that sense, the Orochi's heart was one of the top-rated items among the elixirs Yu-Wan knew. But even considering that, the speed at which his stats were increasing was beyond his imagination. There was one reason for this. The mana that the heart holds is hardly being lost. Consuming an elixir was different from a simple meal. Apart from purifying the poison, how much of the mana the elixir contained could be absorbed depended solely on luck and the user's mana control. But no matter how good your mana control was, it was impossible for Yu-Wan at his current level to absorb all of the mana contained in the Orochi's heart. And yet, the mana that the Orochi's heart contained was being absorbed by Yu-1 without any significant loss. Why is that? He remembered a skill he had forgotten about. Yu-1 quickly checked his skills. Master of Mana. Hash rank, S+. Hash proficiency, 3.05%. Master of Mana. It greatly enhances overall recovery, resistance, and affinity for mana. In addition to that, it was a skill with an option called Dominance. He didn't know what this unfamiliar option was when he first saw it, but now he thought he understood a little bit. The mana follows me on its own. After consuming the elixir, the mana that he couldn't make his own and ended up being wasted. It was as if that mana was following him of its own accord. This is another new discovery. Magic power has increased by 1. My stats went up again. Even at this moment, I could feel the mana rising within me. It's an incredible speed. I'm already looking at 90 stats. If I can just raise it to triple digits. Crunch. Wu-1 clenched the herb tighter. He stuffed the herb into his mouth and neutralized the poison that had begun to spread again. This process had been going on for several days. Perhaps it would take more than a few days to detoxify all the poison that the Orochi's heart contained and absorb all the mana. Wu-1 laughed happily, even though his insides were burning and blood was dripping from his mouth. It's going to be a long time. The Heavenly Demon Church was as cold as the winter in the North Sea. A group that had not interacted with the outside world for a long time. A foreign land, separated from the vast world of the tower and the world of the 10th floor. However, a small wind had recently been blowing through the Heavenly Demon Church. It's already been a month. I guess he's going to fill up 3 months. Yeah, I thought he'd come out to get some supplies in the middle. Kwang Ha-muk looked at the entrance to the training hall where Wu-1 had entered. A month had already passed. All Wu-1 had taken with him were the medicinal herbs he had received from the hospital. He hadn't taken any weapons or supplies from the Heavenly Demon Church. A player who has reached the 10th floor would never miss the opportunity to learn the martial arts of the Murim world. That guy should know that much. Wu-1, who was expected to open the door and come out in the middle, did not show up, as if he didn't need any other preparation or rest. There's no sign of any internal energy either. Quan Qianju's training was so noisy that it shook the peaks of Qiansan. On the other hand, Wu-1 had not made any noticeable sound or movement until now. The two were in stark contrast. Quan Qianju has been in seclusion for 3 months. Perhaps he is trying to catch up on his training. It seemed like a lot of fuss over a player who had only reached the 10th floor. However, it was understandable considering his sparring with Qian Ya-ryong and his provocative remarks. If so, Wu-1 should have reacted similarly. But Wu-1 was so quiet that it made one wonder if he had died inside. What kind of training is he doing? It's so quiet. Yeah, he can't have been meditating for a whole month. I heard he took all the herbs from the hospital. Wait, Kwang Ha-muk interrupted Qian Ya-ryong. Be quiet for a moment. Thud, a presence could be felt from inside the training hall. Wu-1, who had not moved at all until now, finally moved. The presence grew closer. Kwang Ha-muk listened to the footsteps and said, "He's coming out." Creak, the door to the training hall opened. Chapter 57, I was going to come out anyway. Why should I bother keeping the tasteless thing? After almost a month, Yu-1 came out of the training hall looking emaciated. His face was pale and bloodless, and he looked so white and pale that it seemed like he hadn't seen the light for a long time. What is it? Did he come out of training, or was he sick? Is it because of the herbs? At that rate, it's not even a 3-second diet, but a 1-second diet. For a moment, Kwang Ha-muk and Chun Ya-ryong had to think about Yu-1. No matter how much you shouldn't judge a player just by their appearance, Yu-1's condition seemed that serious. Are you here to meet me? Yu-1 asked, spotting Kwang Ha-muk and Chun Ya-ryong waiting at the entrance of the training hall. Unlike his appearance, which made him look weak, Yu-1's gait was not much of a problem. No, it even seemed more stable than before. Kwang Ha-muk did not miss a single step. Did you learn the Dharma inside? The distance was getting closer. Kwang Ha-muk tried not to show what he was thinking inside and answered. I just stopped by while passing by. So, did you have any results in the training hall? Kwang Ha-muk, who was about to ask if there were any results, soon closed his mouth. Yu-1, who was receiving new clothes from Sevi, who had been waiting nearby. It was because of the strong smell of herbs coming from him. I heard that you received all kinds of herbs from the medical clinic. It was a story that Kwang Ha-muk knew well. It was news that the challenger had demanded a huge amount of herbs and antidotes, leaving no herbs left in the medical clinic. At that time, I wondered where I would use so many herbs. It is common to get injured during martial arts training, but I didn't think I would use that many herbs. Don't tell me it's all. Chun Ya Ryong also smelled the strong scent of herbs from Yu-won and hurried into the training hall. Perhaps he was trying to see if the training hall smelled the same way. I'm hungry. Yu-won stroked his stomach, which had been filled with bitter herbs and antidotes. Let's eat first. Dalgrak, Dalgak, Jeek, Ujik. Yu-won ate the food like a pig. He tore the chicken leg and put it in his mouth, and as if that wasn't enough, he pointed at the stir-fried vegetables with chopsticks. While doing so, his eyes scanned the other food on the table. Kwang Ha-muk, who was eating with him across the table, asked, stopping his hand. Did you starve for a month? There was a walgokden in the training hall. It doesn't taste good, but if you eat it, you can fill your hunger and get nutrients to some extent. If there was an error and the walgokden was not filled, I would have come out of the training hall right away. I was going to leave anyway. Why would I bother taking that awful stuff with me? Are you sure? Yes. After answering, Wu-won began eating again. He really must have starved for a whole month. No, he probably didn't actually starve. Wu-won's stomach must have been filled with something other than food. I can't believe he took all of those medicinal herbs. The lingering sense of various medicinal herbs still hadn't disappeared. Where did he even use all those medicinal herbs? It doesn't look like he got any injuries. Did he get addicted to poison or something? Kwang Ha-muk's eyes widened as he considered that possibility. Addiction. That would explain it. Sometimes, there were elixirs with such strong toxicity that they were difficult to take. In those cases, the toxicity was stronger than the elixir's efficacy, so it was used more as a poison than as an elixir. However, if you could infinitely receive antidotes from the hospital without worrying about paying for them, that would explain it. A toxic elixir. However, there was still a question. Just how toxic was the elixir? Eating had already become secondary. Kwang Ha-muk was busy watching Wu-won, who had almost finished his food, including Kwang Ha-muk's portion. When they had finished eating, Wu-won said, I will excuse myself. Wu-won, who had filled his stomach, stood up without hesitation. After eating a full meal, his initially haggard and pitiful appearance had completely vanished. Where are you going? I'm going to the martial arts repository. The martial arts repository? Yes. Since he had finished his first task, it was time to prepare for the next one. Well, as a player, 2 months of martial arts training is probably better than just leveling up. Wu-won's actions were the most rational and understandable since he had first come to the Cheonma divine sect. Kwang Ha-muk nodded. Just keep in mind that there are restrictions on the books you can read. I understand. Then, Wu-won gave a short bow to Kwang Ha-muk and left. After asking the attendant for directions, he was able to head to a large building guarded by dozens of armed men. Wu-won glanced at the armed men as he followed the attendant. Are they all players? He couldn't tell if they were pure-blood members of the Cheonma divine sect like Kwang Ha-muk or Cheon Ya Ryong, but they were all players who had climbed the tower to some extent. Among them, there were even players who seemed to be more skilled than Kwang Ha-muk. They might even be close to being rankers. No, there's even a real ranker. Wu-won looked at the man guarding the entrance to the martial arts repository. He had the most ordinary face and unremarkable clothing, but he could tell for sure. That man was the strongest here. They have tight security. Even the Cheonma divine sect had assigned a ranker, one of the few they had, to guard it. I guess that makes sense. That's obvious. A martial art based on Bajikwan, 8 extremities fist. It's a bit more complicated, but it's more powerful, but the defense is weak. The martial arts library was the most important space in any clan. The books recorded and stored there were the foundation and roots of the clan, and it was no different for anything else. What more for the heavenly demon cult that claims to be the best clan under the heavens, the first door in the world, and has also produced the best person under the heavens, the best person in the world, Cheonma. It means that you can never read more information than what is allowed. This wasn't just a test by the heavenly demon cult. The clans that belong to the Murim world receive recognition as a test through the Tower's system. The heavenly demon cult was no different. This is the Tower's test. The Tower's test wasn't so sloppy that you could easily read more information than what was allowed. Do you really have to do this? I won't be able to read it even if there were no guards. Yuan asked, annoyed by the gaze of the guard following him, and a warrior who seemed to be a ranker answered. It's procedure, so please follow it. It seemed like he had more manners than Kwang Ha-jin. He had heard that most of the heavenly demon cult's warriors are belligerent and don't have much formality. Yuan didn't bother to ask further at the unknown warrior's answer. Since they are conducting the heavenly demon cult's test, they won't meddle or interfere with what he's doing anyway. As long as I don't cross the line. Yuan, who finished the simple procedure, stepped inside the building. A high ceiling, and bookshelves that were piled up high enough to reach that high ceiling. Oh, for a moment, even Yuan let out an exclamation. How many books could there be? Hundreds of thousands? No, millions. At this point, it shouldn't be called a martial arts library, but a giant library. You cannot go beyond the space connected to the door over there. Keep that in mind, and feel free to use the books in here. The captain of the guards said so and stepped aside so as not to get in the way. Yuan was surprised that there was another door in the direction the captain of the guards pointed at. An iron door that seemed to have quite a lot of dust on it. That wasn't all. Are all the books here lower-level martial arts books that can be read? The heavenly demon cult's history boasts thousands of years. They existed before entering the tower's world, and have endlessly created and developed martial arts and advanced them. This martial arts library is a place where the essence of the heavenly demon cult is melted. It's greater than I thought. Yuan had experience reading the martial arts libraries of various clans, including the Namgung Sega. As a player who will become a ranker and who used to be a ranker, he had been invited by the Murim World's clans who wanted to look good to Yuan and had been on a tour. It's 3 times the size of the Namgung Sega. No, it must be 4 times. Yuan took out any book that he could reach. The characters of the Murim World were automatically translated by the system. The martial world's text was automatically translated by the system. There must be a clue here that can help me deal with him. Is it a fist technique using the 8 extremities fist Bajikwan? It's a bit more complicated, but it's powerful, but the defense is poor. While he was at it, Yuan tried to follow the illustrations drawn in the book. He had some knowledge of martial arts since he had passed the 10th floor's test once. He followed the movements for a while. Yuan soon closed the bookshelf. Martial arts just don't suit me. He had mastered it to some extent, but that was it. In the tower where the power of the system exists, martial arts is just a slow and frustrating discipline. Unless one has considerable talent in martial arts, it is not a very effective way to become stronger by learning martial arts. Yuan, who put a book back in its place, looked around the vast library. A vast amount. I wondered when I would ever see all of this. But there was nothing he could do about it. It would be better to look through one library than to look through the entire Cheonma Divine Church. The 3 months won't be given for nothing. The tower does not test the impossible. That's because an impossible test loses its meaning as a test. It was an unchanging law that Yuan remembered. And this test was definitely a difficulty level that would have been close to impossible for an ordinary player. Ranker. A ranker who can withstand the 3-second ritual of Quan Cheonju. Is that a test that can be given to a player who just reached the 10th floor? From the moment he first heard it, Yuan thought the test was strange. Of course, he thought he could pass it, and he tried to challenge it right away because he thought the reward would be greater as he shortened the time, but the strangeness remained. The keyword to clear the test is the 3 months. And it's in the support provided to the players. That's why I came to the library to find it. 2 months left. Yuan began to seriously search the martial arts library. I'll find it in a month at the latest. Sarek. He took out a book, opened the first page, glanced at it, and put it back in. There was no need to read it at length. Picking out hundreds of thousands of books one by one and skimming through them to categorize them was by no means an easy task. No, it is virtually impossible to read all of these books. It was impossible to read all these martial arts books and decide which one to learn. There were many ways to save time, such as examining the types of books, looking at the covers and titles, and looking at the first chapter. That's because there was something I found interesting. This is a mental method. This is a swordsmanship. This is a meditation method. Is there such a thing? What Yuan wanted was not swordsmanship, Taoism, or Dharma. It must be there. Quan Cheonju, the protagonist who leads the Cheonma Divine Church and is considered one of the best in the martial world. Ranker, the beginning of Cheonma Ryong, demonic spirit. Within this, there must be a clue that I can use to confront him. Chapter 58. A whole fortnight. Yes, they say he spent that much time just looking through martial art books in the archives. Shin Mu-Cup put down the teacup he was drinking as he listened to the report from his subordinate. He had heard the news that Yuan, who had entered the training hall, had come out. He thought that Yuan would choose a few martial arts and go back into the training hall, but he hadn't come out for the past fortnight. What on earth is he doing in there? When I went to check, it seemed like he was going to look through every single book. All of them. Shin Moo-kuk had also been to the martial arts archives a few times. He had even picked up a few books and looked through them. That's why he knew how big the martial arts archives of the heavenly martial cult were. To go through all of those books, even if he was given 3 years, not 3 months, it would be impossible. I heard he took a lot of medicinal herbs from the clinic. He's been acting very strangely. Personally, I don't think he's someone the Lord should be concerned about. His subordinates' thoughts were understandable. If he was a martial artist, and a player who had reached the 10th floor of the Murim, it was natural for him to learn and practice martial arts. Even if it was an individual's choice to fully learn and delve into them, at least Yu-won's current actions seemed like he was just wasting his time. Do you think his actions are strange? Yes, I think so too. Shin Moo-kuk looked at his own face reflected in the teacup. I can't predict a single one of his thoughts or actions. He thought that Yu-won would just train in the training hall for the 3 months given to him. There was nothing else to do anyway. However, Yu-won's actions up until now had continuously defied his expectations. A smile spread across Shin Moo-kuk's lips. That's why I have even more expectations. The more he defies my expectations, the more. Shin Moo-kuk, who had seen Yu-won up close, got a strange feeling from him. The power he clearly felt wasn't that great. Of course, it was hard to believe considering he was a player who had reached the 10th floor, but even so, he wasn't at a level where he could be compared to the rankers at the top of the tower. However, I can tell just by looking at his eyes. Was it because he knew that he would become a ranker one day? The higher a person's ideals and goals, the more likely their eyes would look farther and higher than others. At first, Shin Moo-kuk had thought that was the case with Yu-won. But that only lasted for a moment. Let's get started right away. Yu-won, who boldly said he would take Kwon Cheon-ju's test right now, gave off a different feeling. It's not that he's looking at a higher place, but that he's already standing in a higher place. It wasn't arrogance or pride. To him, it was the most natural thing in the world. Even this test of the heavenly martial cult seemed infinitely small and shabby compared to the world he was looking at. This place was just a road he was passing through. Yu-won's eyes hadn't been on this test from the start. He was looking at a much higher place than this. Another month passed. Of the 3 months promised, 2 months had passed in total. And it was when Yu-won had gone through half of the books in the martial arts archives. Thud. Yu-won closed the book. The guards who had been watching thought that Yu-won would put the book back in its original place like he always did. But this time, it was different. Yu-won muttered as he picked up the book. Found it. He had spent a month cooped up in the martial arts archives, barely sleeping as he filled his stomach with compressed food. Yu-won left the martial arts archives. And then, another month passed. A month in the training hall, a month in the archives and another month in the training hall. Kwon Cheon-ju, who had come out of seclusion, rested for a day before getting up and hearing the news. Kwon Cheon-ju, who had come out of closed-door training, rested for a day and then got up to deliver the news. Kwon Cheon-ju's appearance caused a brief commotion. The external player's loyalty to the heavenly demon cult was lacking. Yu-won arrived, and Shin Moo-kuk said that the test was being watched by several guilds in the tower. Kwon Cheon-ju wanted Yu-won to block his samchosake, but Yu-won said he would pass the test with his own power. Yu-won took out the Black Knight sword, and the test began. The heavenly demon cult, isolated from the outside world. The incidents and accidents that occurred within it were nothing special. Even when he heard the news, the only new information was about Yu-won. I don't know if it's worth the effort. Yu-won's actions over the past 3 months had been nothing special. He took elixirs and herbs and practiced martial arts from the martial arts library for a month. 1 month. No matter how powerful the system was, it was a short time to learn martial arts. He must have barely started walking. On that subject, he dared to try to block his samchosake. There's no point in closing the gate. Kwon Cheon-ju put on his armor and left his quarters. The stage was a training ground prepared for the sword master's training. The cult's martial artists were already busy moving to watch the test. Is it about to start? I'm going to have a good look for a long time. It's not often that we get a chance to see Cheon-ju's skills. That Kim Yu-won guy is pretty famous downstairs, isn't he? Just downstairs. I hear it's a mess upstairs too. Even the big guilds are trying to contact him. Maybe the big guilds all know that Kim Yu-won is here. Even so, isn't he just a newbie who just got to the 10th floor? Have you already forgotten what happened to the Black Storm Guild Master? Oh, Right, the reason this test was so attention was not simply because it was the first time in a long time that a player had challenged the heavenly demon cult. Kim Yu-won, he had broken through the trials of each floor, changed the rankings, and achieved something that even the top-ranked high rankers, the rulers of the tower, had not achieved. Because Kim Yu-won was the challenger, the people of the heavenly demon cult had high expectations. Could this finally be the first player to pass the heavenly demon cult's test? If Yu-won passed the heavenly demon cult's test and went up, it might not be a dream for the heavenly demon cult to revive. Kukukuku, Guan Qianju, who had sharpened his hearing to hear the sound, stifled a laugh. Su-ha, who had been following him, gasped for a moment, closed his mouth, and took careful steps. The fighting spirit qi emanating from Guan Qianju was that murderous. If he approached carelessly, Guan Qianju's fist would crush his body. Everyone seems to have high expectations. Everyone was expecting Yu-won. Some of them had even made bets on whether Yu-won would pass the test. It was funny, how great could he be that a kid who had just set foot on the 10th floor could compete with him? Of course, this could not be called a competition. He was only going to block the Samcho's sake. No, it's not just that. How could the heavenly demon give such a test? No matter how great a player was, he was not a ranker. He was also a player in the lower section who had just reached the 10th floor. Even if he had the ability to subdue the heavenly dragon in an instant, that alone would not be enough to block his first strike. It's time to go, Su-ha urged Guan Qianju, who had not moved for a while. This test was so important that there was a rumor that the heavenly demon would be watching in person. Even for Guan Qianju, it was unacceptable to be late for such an occasion. Yeah, Guan Qianju moved his feet, which had been stopped for a moment. Let's go. Thud, thud, leaving the inner and outer gardens, he arrived at the training ground. The training ground was quiet. However, the area around it was packed with people. Nearly 1,000 members of the heavenly demon cult were gathered. But they were holding their breath and waiting for the stage to be completed. He's here, Guan Qianju. Wow, man, I'm seeing him for the first time. When else will we get to see a ranker fight? I've seen it once, it's no joke. Guan Qianju's sudden appearance created a brief commotion. At the same time, his brow furrowed. Such frivolous words. Indeed, more than half of these people were players who had come from outside. There were players like Qian Ya Ryong and Kwang Ha Muk who had been born into the heavenly demon church, but there were also quite a few who were not. One could not expect them to have any loyalty to the heavenly demon church or respect for the heavenly demon. They were just here to watch an interesting fight. Guan Qianju stood on the stage. Wu Wen had not arrived yet. Is this the price? He was not asking anyone in particular. He knew it even if he looked. The 1,000 or so people gathered here were all that remained of the heavenly demon church. The number of believers has decreased significantly. A group isolated from the outside world. As a result, the number of players entering the church decreased, and naturally, the number of people leaving increased. If it weren't for the fearsome reputation of the heavenly demon, the church wouldn't have been able to hold on until now. But that one person was not enough. Has he arrived? Shinmu Geuk, who had arrived earlier and was waiting, approached him. Guan Qianju glanced at the believers gathered in the training ground and asked. Do we have to make such a fuss? This test is being watched by not only the Murim, but also by various guilds in the tower. It's not a bad thing to make a fuss. You've become quite loyal. Of the 4 heavenly lords, Shinmu Geuk was the most intelligent. He had allowed the warriors of the heavenly demon church to watch the test and had even spread rumors about it. Many of the warriors of the heavenly demon church had connections with sects outside the church. The fact that Kim Yu-won was taking the heavenly demon church's test was enough to be a signal flare announcing the revival of the heavenly demon church. The best picture would be him blocking your Samcho Shik here. That won't happen. Well, this is a test. The tower's system was never easygoing. If Guan Qianju intentionally tried to pass Wu Wan, the test would immediately be considered void. In addition, the test would be replaced with another test of similar difficulty. In the end, it was meaningless to take care of Wu Wan here. Even if that weren't the case, I can't guide someone who can't pass the test on his own to the heavenly demon. Is that really the only reason? Guan Qianju snorted at Shinmu Geuk's question. I'll try not to let him die. Thud, thud, the crowd parted. A single person walked into the training ground through the gap. Wu Wan, who had just come out of the training hall, came straight to the training ground, which was the stage of the test. You're late. I came right on time. And, the promised time was noon. The sun was right in the middle of the sky. It was clear that he had arrived exactly at the promised time. The main character usually shows up at the end. Wu Wen put the sword he had been carrying at his waist into his inventory. Then he took out the Black Knight sword that he had put in his inventory. You're using a strange sword. Shin Mu Geuk, sensing that the stage had been set, retreated far away. The training ground was hundreds of meters long. It was more than adequate as a stage for a fight. Let's see how much you've grown in 3 months. Kuwu. A surge of energy began to rise from Quan Qianju's body. And at the same time, a message appeared to Wu Wan, the participant in the test. Starting the test. Avoid or block the Samcho Shik of Quan Qianju, Pungbakrim. The test had begun. Watching Quan Qianju take his stance, Wu Wan tightened his grip on his sword. You will regret this, Samcho Shik, the first of them, Il Cho Shik. For giving you 3 whole months. Quan Qianju, Pungbakrim, thrust his fist forward. Chapter 59. It's because of that skill. Quirung. It seemed like he heard the sound first. It wasn't a real sound. An instinctual gut feeling. A destructive aura powerful enough to make his spine tingle. Flash. A strong light blinded his eyes. Pachionbiokro crushing sky and splitting thunder. Everything where Yu Wan was standing was swept away. Quirung. The same sound from before was heard once again. Yu Wan turned his head to look back at where he had been standing. A blue electric current, and along with the fist that stretched out forward, the ground dozens of meters ahead was deeply gouged by the force. It would have been dangerous if I had gotten caught up in that. It was a powerful technique. And that was just the first one. You dodged it. Pajiji. Guanqianju, Pungbakrim's fist was surrounded by the same electric mana as before. In the Murim world, they called it internal energy. Good judgment. If you had tried to block it instead of dodging it, you would be a bloody mess by now. That was true. He wouldn't just be a bloody mess. If he had been an ordinary player, he would have been burned to a crisp and it would have been hard to even recognize his original form. This much power on the 10th floor. He's out of his mind. Even if this was a test, reducing the penalty enough to allow this much power on the 10th floor was insane. Yu Wan realized once again that the difficulty of this test was beyond reason. Twice now, just like with Kreis, who had also been a ranker, he had aimed for 5 exchanges. But Kreis had stronger penalties and power restrictions, and he had even been injured from his fight with Hephaestus. But now, things were different. Guanqianju, he was several times stronger than Kreis back then. Plus, the penalties were reduced because of the test arena. If you can dodge it, try dodging it again. If the previous hand had been his left, this time it was his right that stretched out. And it was very slow. For Yu Wan, who had been watching Pungbakrim's fist the entire time, it was a speed that could make him yawn. But, it's getting faster. The initial slowness was gone, and soon the fist was moving so fast that it was almost invisible. Bakebo Qianroquan 100-step treading thunder fist. Quarring. The ground shook. The range of the outstretched right arm was much wider than the first technique. It was like thunder crashing down from the sky. Ku-ru-ru. Pungbakrim narrowed his eyes as he stretched out his second technique. Again, Yu Wan had moved early and escaped the range of the technique. This time it had been a close call, but it wasn't something that could be done simply by being fast. He moved before the fist came out. It was as if he had anticipated his own movement. That was when, SSSU, his eyes turned red. They weren't an ordinary color. And it wasn't normal for the color of one's eyes to suddenly change. Because of that skill, a skill that could see through his attacks. It must be at least an A-rank skill. There was no other way he could dodge his fists twice. So that's why you were doing that. With eyes like that and the speed to match it, it wouldn't be hard to dodge even the most powerful attacks 3 times. Pungbakrim realized why Yu Wan had asked to start the test right away and sneered. What a pathetic loser. Rumble. The sky above Cheonma Mountain. Dark clouds covered it. Dark clouds covered the peak of Cheonma Mountain, higher than the clouds. Blue lightning gathered in Pungbakrim's hand, and sparks flew everywhere. The top of this tower is a whole other world that you don't know about. Shin Mu Geuk, who was watching the fight, clicked his tongue. Even if it was weaker than he knew, the aftereffects would reach beyond the martial arts hall at this rate. I guess I'll have to lend a hand. I'll do it. Qianju stood up from his seat. He prepared to stop Pungbakrim's influence from reaching beyond the martial arts hall. Yu Wan also realized that this third Qianqi was different from the ones before. I can't dodge this. The power might not be as strong as before. Even Pungbakrim wouldn't be able to exert enough power to completely burn this area to the ground. That wasn't a power that was allowed to Pung Bek Rim, who wasn't even a high ranker, even if it was on the stage of the test. Instead, the range is wide, but the power is weak. Crack, Yu-Won planted his feet firmly on the ground. Crackle, crackle, the power of the Black King's stone flowed through his hand and into his sword. And on top of that, strength of a giant fills your arms. Partial gigantification is in progress. Thud, thud. The strength of a giant filled both arms. Yu-Won held his sword with both hands. The energy of the Black King's stone gathered on the sword, darkening the already black blade even further. A smile spread across Pung Bek Rim's lips as he saw it. You plan to block it? He instinctively sensed that he couldn't dodge it. He thought that he would focus on evasion since he had those eyes, but it was an unexpected judgment. And that judgment was correct. The only problem was that his opponent was him. Because this couldn't be dodged or blocked. Rumble. Thunderbolt of Genesis. The dark clouds opened up. Boom. A torrential downpour of thunderbolts fell on the martial arts hall where the two stood. Thick smoke rose above the martial arts hall. Dust rose, and gravel from the broken ground flew up. Sizzle, crackle, lightning that hadn't yet disappeared flowed through the smoke. The spectators watching the overwhelming power had their mouths wide open. This is a rancor. Are you kidding me? Isn't this because the penalty hasn't disappeared yet? Then how much stronger would it be normally? I almost dead. The spectator watching from the closest distance took a step back while watching the ground in front of him burning up. If venerable creator of heaven had not stepped forward and blocked it earlier, Harryly would have been Katupin supreme creator of heaven's thunderclap. So, what is the result? The thickly rising fog dispersed. The first person to reveal himself was Pung Bek Lim. Unlike before, he no longer smiled or had an expression of interest. Anyone who looked at this expression could tell it is an expression of surprise. Ya blocked them. It was something that the himself had only guessed at. Pung Bek Lim looked at Tuan's appearance, which had been revealed through the thickly spread fog. You have blocked Supreme Creator of Heaven Pung Bek Lim's three divine arts. You have passed the second test of Cheonmasan Church. A message popped up. Yuan rubbed his stinging back of his hand with his other hand. The electricity to the had not been able to block or let flow due to taking it with his body had paralyzed his body a little. But it was just that. Yuan had taken Pung Bek Lim's three divine arts, which he washer the must basing a lot, without any major injuries. Is this a combination of martial art and skill? Even Yuan had not seen it properly a fair few times. The divine arts that Pung Bek Lim had shown were no ordinary divine arts. Hwasa martial artist born into Cheonmasan Church, Bettina Nikkei's, Hwasa player and ranker who had climbed the tower just like Yuan. Of course, he during the time he spent climbing the tower, he had learned and mastered mana skills, and the skills she had acquired numbered in the double and triple digits. And these three divine arts of Pung Bek Lim were completed through combinations of those acquired skills. I thought you would be block them. Thud, Pung Bek Lim narrowed that stance and walked forward. It seemed that the did not think it was meaningful to put distance between himself and his moves to successively fire off powerful divine arts. Booted, I didn't think you would block them so perfectly. The gaze of Pung Bek Lim, who looked at Yuan, changed. Moreover, the aura spread around him, centered in him, began to move in a bizarre way. Crackle, crackle, the faintly visible beginning signs of Apanalti. It meant that Pung Bek Lim was beginning to push his strength to the limit. Do you want to continue? The test was over. If Yuan refused, Pung Bek Lim would have an reason or qualification to continue this test. After that, every time he tried to attack Yuan again, Apanalti would be applied, and moreover, it would go against the will of the heavenly demon. However, would you like to continue this test? Yuan intended to agree with his request. Very much so. Of course. Yuan had not lowered his sword yet. Pung Bek Lim smiled radiantly. He looked at Yuan with his competitive eyes. Then, boom, Pung Bek Lim's fists collided. The spectators around were surprised at the sound that seemed like a clap of thunder. Let's continue playing. Crackle, crackle. Would Hargan become like that when he becomes Saran? As the lightning flowing from his two fists approached, it felt like his body would burn up. Pung Bek Lim no longer had any intention of evaluating Wu Won within the framework of a test. He extended his two fists, intending to fight Wu Won regardless of the number of preliminary moves. Then come in first. Pung Bek Lim readily conceded the initiative. However, the expression that had been full of joy soon became distorted. Tisk, tisk, the lightning flowing from his body shook unsteadily. In Pung Bek Lim's eyes, he could see a faint haze blooming behind Wu Won's back. Internal strength. No, something that mana had taken shape. It was crude, but Pung Bek Lim clearly noticed what it was. No, he felt it. You bastard. The tip of Peng Baekrim's finger pointing at Wu Won shook slightly. How did you get Cheonma Ryong? It's not enough to call it Cheonma Ryong yet. Wu Won replied calmly to Peng Baekrim's words. This is just the basics, the form. Mana visualized, something that has its own will. Wu Won looked at the haze blooming around him. This is just the shell of Cheonma Ryong. That too, incomplete. The haze moved as if to protect Wu Won. It really seemed to have a will of its own. And Peng Baekrim instinctively felt a strong aversion to it. Crackle, crackle. The fact that the lightning of Peng Baekrim, who had expressed hostility toward Wu Won, had become unstable was proof of that. Peng Baekrim, who seemed about to strike Wu Won at any moment, suddenly seemed to lose his will. Fortunately, it works. Peng Baekrim, the supreme master of the Cheonma Divine Church. He and the other 4 supreme masters were all born and raised in the Cheonma Divine Church, and had learned their martial arts there. They had outstanding talent in martial arts. They were the few players who became stronger through martial arts training rather than leveling up. That's how they became rankers. Learning the martial arts of the Cheonma Divine Church. Cheonma Ryong is the root and foundation of the Cheonma Divine Church. The martial arts learned by Cheonma Cheon Mu Jin are visualized. Gulp. Wu Won took a step toward Peng Baekrim. He could feel it, Peng Baekrim's instinctive aversion to Cheonma Ryong, even though it was just a shell. His energy was shaken because of it. If this were the real Cheonma Ryong, I could have made him submit with just a word. Cheonma holds absolute power and authority within the Cheonma Divine Church. This was the reason why the Cheonma Divine Church supported him like a god. The warriors of the Cheonma Divine Church could never go against Cheonma. The duration of Cheonma Ryong is at most 3 or 4 minutes. Crackle, crackle. Wu Won approached Peng Baekrim, unleashing the power of the Black Soul Stone to its limits. I don't have time. As you said, I will go in first. Chapter 60. Clang, boom, rumble, crash. Fists and swords clashed, sending shockwaves and mana scattering in all directions. A fist shook precariously. Kwancheonju Peng Baekrim was now facing Yu Won with all his might. There was one reason. Fight me fair and square, Kim Yu Won. It was because of the faint but clear energy of Cheonma Shinsu flowing from Yu Won's body. I didn't use any dirty tricks. Crackle. The energy of the Black Sky Stone surged as Yu Won's sword pushed back Peng Baekrim's body. At the same time, a notification rang out. You have blocked the 47th style of Kwancheonju Peng Baekrim. Naturally, the message of the test's progress continued to ring in Yu Won's head. That's right, this was a test, and it was just a test to block 3 basic styles. Even so, everyone in the Heavenly Demon cult had said it with one voice. They said this was a ridiculous test. But, is it really Cheonma Shinsu? It seems so. It doesn't even have a proper form yet. Yu Won was now showing a fight almost on par with Peng Baekrim in the test. How? I heard he spent a month in the martial arts repository. I guess he got his hands on that. Was Cheonma Shinsu there? That's just the basics that he's barely gotten the hang of. But even if it's just the shell, Cheonma Shinsu is Cheonma Shinsu. It wasn't hard to guess where Yu Won had gotten his hands on Cheonma Shinsu. His whereabouts for the past 3 months had been that simple. However, Yu Won's achievements were not so simple to dismiss. He got his hands on Cheonma Shinsu on only the 2nd test. Shin Mu-kuk trembled at the energy he felt from Yu Won. Look at that, that was a player who had only just reached the 10th floor. Even with the help of Cheonma Shinsu, any other player would have stopped at blocking Peng Baekrim's 3rd style. No, in fact, even that was uncertain. No matter how much Cheonma Shinsu had an absolute advantage over the Heavenly Demon cult's martial arts, that was just the basics of the basics, a mere shell of Cheonma Shinsu. Furthermore, Kwancheonju was a ranker who had reached the top of the tower. But now, Yu Won was showing a fight almost on par with Peng Baekrim, wielding the Cheonma Shinsu. Maybe, really, Shin Mu-kuk's eyes were fixed on Yu Won as he charged towards Peng Baekrim. He might be qualified. Clang, another notification rang out. Yu Won frowned at his tingling wrist. Really, it was an overwhelming power. You have blocked the 49th style of Kwancheonju Peng Baekrim. Thud, Peng Baekrim was also pushed back. He had been weakened by the influence of Cheonma Shinsu. However, Peng Baekrim's momentum was rising higher and higher as time went on. Is he getting used to it? Cheonma Ryong and Peng Baekrim were fighting each other for the first time. At first, he was naturally bewildered, and his response was bound to be immature. No matter how strong Peng Baekrim was, it wouldn't be easy for him to overcome the awkwardness of having to throw a punch at Cheonma Ryong. However, if that was the only reason, it would be difficult to understand how he could become so strong so quickly. Or maybe my Cheon Malryong has become weaker. Perhaps it was a combination of both reasons. Crackle, sparks flew from Poonbakrim's body. This was not Poonbakrim's penalty. This time, the power was strong. Instead of swinging his sword, Yu-won held the handle firmly with both hands. He manifested his gigantification and maximized the power of the Black Star Stone. Flash, boom, a heavy shock struck the blade. Once again, the wrist holding the sword tingled. If it had been an ordinary sword, it might have shattered into pieces. I should thank the old man. Wung. At the same time, 3 mana zones appeared around Yu-won and Poonbakrim. Poonbakrim also knew that Yu-won was preparing the mana zone, but he didn't care and charged forward. Gigantification, mana zone, bang, boom, flames poured down towards Poonbakrim. Yu-won took a few more steps back. There was a slight burn on Poonbakrim's body. He's so strong, be proud that you even made a wound like this. Swish, Poonbakrim waved his hand lightly and broke free from the influence of the mana zone that Yu-won had created. As expected, a rancor was a rancor. Unless he was exerting too much power and was affected by the penalty, it was difficult for Yu-won to deal a proper blow to him with his mana. If only Cheon Malryong had matured a little more. Yu-won thought of a few more assumptions and shook his head. No, his opponent wasn't a rookie like Krius who had just become a rancor. Kwon Cheonju Poonbakrim, fighting him was not part of Yu-won's plan in the first place. Tap, tap, Poonbakrim seemed to be more concerned about his scorched uniform than his body, and brushed it off with his hand. This is ridiculous. His tone was absurd. This Poonbakrim can't catch a little rookie who just climbed to the 10th floor. It was a great deal of pride in his abilities. But it would be the same for anyone, not just Poonbakrim. The players of the tower called those who failed to pass the 10th floor, newbies. Strictly speaking, Yu-won was a newbie, albeit at the bottom of the ladder. A fight between a newbie and a rancor. It was an obvious fight. That was why this test hid the hidden piece Cheon Malryong and made him endure the 3 seconds. But, my pride is hurt. His movements were much more agile than before. For a moment, Yu-won felt his bones tremble. Poonbakrim opened his mouth and laughed. Unlike before, it was quite a refreshing laugh. Yu-won got into position. There was no time to stand around and argue. It seems like the duration of Cheon Malryong isn't that long. I can tell by how much you're rushing. As expected, Poonbakrim knew. Of course, it was impossible for Yu-won to handle Cheon Malryong, which he had only learned for a little over a month, as if he had mastered it. That would be impossible even for a genius. Naturally, its duration had to be short. Bring it on. Fortunately, that was Poonbakrim's personality. He didn't know how to avoid it. Instead of using weapons with long reach, such as a spear, a sword, or a blade, he chose to use his fists because of his personality. He now regretted that the duration of Cheon Malryong was ending. Rather, he thought he had to finish Yu-won off within that time. That was the only way he could restore his shattered pride, even a little. Bang, Poonbakrim jumped. Yu-won moved like he was dancing to match him. Bang, bang, bang. I don't know where you learned that, but that's great, too. Poonbakrim shouted in delight as he punched to break through Yu-won's defense. As the match dragged on, the sweat on Yu-won's forehead grew thicker. The Cheon Malryong that had been maintained behind his back gradually faded. This was the limit. It's over. Peesh. The form of Cheon Malryong that had been hanging on Yu-won's back disappeared. And at the same time, the momentum in Poonbakrim's fist changed. Thud, an impact that seemed like it could break a sword in an instant. Screech. Yu-won's body was pushed back violently. You have blocked the Poonbakrim's 89th style. Poonbakrim also seemed to feel that his sluggishness had disappeared. Poonbakrim, who paused for a moment, clenched and unclenched his fists to test his strength. Soon after, a smirk appeared on his lips. Now it's getting interesting. It's not so fun for me anymore. Haha, it's just getting started, and you're already whining. Buzz. His fist filled his vision. A sword was wedged between Yu-won's face and Poonbakrim's fist. Clang. Yu-won's body was blown back more than 10 steps. For a moment, he felt like his body was floating in the air. Wow, it was definitely different from before. He seemed to know how much Poonbakrim had found Cheon Malryong annoying. He's definitely a completely different person. He had to change his judgment. It was now difficult to fight him head-on. Won. Whoosh. Yu-won focused on activating Won. Buzz. He could see it. Poonbakrim's fist extending toward him. Wu-won dodged Peng Baek-rim's fist as he ran in. And a counterattack. I don't have time to do it. Bang! His left fist appeared. His movements were much more agile than before. In an instant, Wu-won felt a chill run down his spine. If he gets hit by that even once, it will be a disaster. Wu-won's physical strength stat was high, but it was not as great as his strength or magical power stat. 2 shots. If he gets hit by that much, he'll be in a lot of trouble. But that's only if I can block it with my transformation. Wu-won looked into Peng Baek-rim's eyes. He looked at his eyes, his hands, and his feet. He didn't miss a single movement of his muscles. Are you just trying to avoid me now? Peng Baek-rim's eyes were now saying that he didn't care anymore. It was absurd for him and Wu-won to face each other head-on in the first place. Now that Cheon Ma-ryong was gone, he no longer thought that Wu-won would fight him head-on. Oh yeah, good, go ahead and do whatever you want. Crackle, he raised his internal energy, even though he was taking a penalty. Sparks flew around his hands and surroundings. A huge field of smoke filled with his lightning energy. Fist of Heaven, this is against the rules. Du Cheonju and Chong Cheonju tried to stop Peng Baek-rim. However, Shin Mu-geuk stopped them. Just watch. 1. Isn't Cheonma watching? Only then did Du Cheonju and Chong Cheonju notice Cheon Mu-jin watching the fight from one side. That wasn't the only reason Shin Mu-geuk had stopped them. The person taking the test has not objected. Wu-won was the subject of this test. He was the one taking the test, and he had already passed. The fight that was going on now was just an extension of his choice. If he wanted to give up, he could do so at any time. But, he's not giving up because he believes in something. He dodged or blocked the first 3 seconds. After that, he used Cheon Ma-ryong to fight head-on. And now that Cheon Ma-ryong is gone, maybe this is a chance to see his true abilities. He's not afraid or surprised even though he's facing the power of a ranker. Shin Mu-geuk looked at Wu-won's eyes standing in front of Peng Baek-rim. As I thought, that guy is. Boom, the fists filled with lightning energy collided. Peng Baek-rim took a step towards Wu-won, raising his momentum to the max. Boom, the ground where he stepped on caved in. At the same time, Wu-won walked towards Peng Baek-rim. He's not dodging. Peng Baek-rim was the one who was surprised. Cheon Ma-ryong was already gone. Since Wu-won no longer had any means of defense, he thought that if he raised his strength to this extent, he would naturally choose to dodge rather than confront him, but Wu-won came closer into his range instead. Sizzle. Peng Baek-rim sensed it. It was a short, but it was a practice that had become too long for its time. But the end always comes. Oh yeah, and now, let's finish this. Towards that end, Peng Baek-rim threw a punch.